Testing, testing. Testing, testing.
We're good.
I'd like to welcome everybody to the Planning Commission meeting for Tuesday, March 26th. If everyone would please stand, I'd like to call the meeting to order and say the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, can we have roll call, please?
Commissioner Marlowe?
Present.
Commissioner Connolly?
Here.
Commissioner Davis?
Here.
Commissioner Neal?
Here.
Commissioner Kogler?
Here.
Commissioner Covarrubias?
Here.
Chairperson Christensen?
Here.
All present.
Right. How about staff introductions, please?
Marcy Reynoso and Ashley Peterson, Administrative Assistants.
Warren Frace, Community Development Director.
Katie Bannister, Associate Planner.
Annie Brandon, Legal Counsel on the line.
All right, thank you very much. Are there any matters regarding that, comments on matters that are not on the agenda for tonight? Anyone here wish to comment? Okay, any callers on that?
No callers.
Thank you. Seeing none, we'll move on. And the agenda items proposed, are there any to be rescheduled or postponed?
There are none.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to public hearings here. Tonight we have a discussion item, the Comprehensive Zoning Code Update Description. Do we have a presentation?
Thank you, Chairperson Christensen. So tonight, Genevieve Sharrow from MIG, who's been our consultant for this whole process, will be giving the bulk of the presentation. But as the agenda indicates, we're looking tonight at Articles 3, which is related to the all the different zoning districts in the community, and then the uses that are allowed in those zones, and the development standards for that are specific to certain zones. In addition, we'll be looking at Article 8, which is the environmental standards for things like hillsides and floodplains and the like. And so those are the two articles that we have the most focus on this evening. Of course, any of the zoning code is open for discussion, but we've been working on this process since 2021. We consider this to be the last workshop for the Planning Commission's consideration. The next time we come back to Planning Commission, we do hope to come with a full final draft that has all the articles, all the comments integrated to the degree that we can, and bring that back to you as a full package. So tonight, Genevieve, like I said, we'll be describing the last two articles that you haven't seen up to this point. So I'm going to turn it over to Genevieve.
Thank you so much, Katie. I'm going to share my screen and get us underway. Good evening, commissioners and members of the public. I'm so happy to be here tonight to walk through the last big chunk of the big work effort that staff and the team has been working on over the last few years. So just a quick refresher on where we're coming from and why we're doing this update. This comprehensive zoning code update really does kind of take apart each section of the existing code with a goal of becoming a code that's really intuitive, user-friendly, and a lot shorter than the existing code is today. We want to make sure that it's internally consistent. It's been updated so many times over the years in some places, but not in others. So we've done a really thorough job of making sure that we have internal consistency now, developing new best practices in modern flexible land use regulations, looking at ways that we can streamline review. And the reformat also includes a lot of new tables and graphics, and really comprehensively looking at the entire code as a way to be more clean, clear, and objective for community and for staff to implement it, including being up to date with current laws. So just a refresher on how this zoning code has been reorganized and what we've gone over with the Planning Commission up to this point. It is organized into 9 primary articles. We have looked at Articles 1, which is kind of lays the groundwork for the zoning code. Article 2, which is the article that looks at how applications and permits are processed and the requirements of those. We looked at Article 4 in depth last time we met last month, which looked at a lot of standards that applied across all of the zones. We looked at fences and signs and a lot of different standards in there. Article 5 has some of those special kind of odd regulations that are really unique that are often kind of sought out independently often. So those are in their own article, and we reviewed that section with you. Article 6 covers the standards for specific land uses and activities. So linked to that land use table, that large land use table, which we'll look at again tonight. And we looked at one of the first meetings that we had with you, though there are some specific standards that are linked to certain uses, and this Article 6 covers those. Article 7 covers nonconformities, and Article 9 has our terms and definitions, not only the land use definitions, but also general definitions. How do we define a setback and a lot and all of those pieces? To have that really clear information outlined in definitions is one of the kind of paramount important things to this update. So today we're going to look at Article 3, as Katie mentioned, and Article 8. And in addition, we'll have a small discussion as well about some minor zoning map amendments that are also folded in with this update. So starting with Article 3, and Article 3, as Katie mentioned, has those uses that are allowed in each zoning district, as well as all the development standards that are in each zoning district. We did previously review that land use table early on in this update process, but we wanted to bring it back to you today in kind of a holistic Article 3, and also point out some of the new changes that we've come across over the last couple of years as we got to this point. So I'll highlight those for you tonight. And then we'll go through each of the remaining chapters, which are broken out into the residential zoning districts, commercial, industrial, and airport zoning districts. The public facilities has their own district with parks and open space and agriculture. And then there's another chunk that it's divided into that covers the overlay zoning districts. And we'll go through each one of those tonight. So starting with chapter 21.32, this will be the land use regulations and zoning districts. So we'll have a new kind of clear location for where the land use table lives. And again, we reviewed this with the Planning Commission back in October of 2022. So here's an image of what the current current land use table looks like, with a lot of specific uses that are broken down to, how many horses, cattle, and sheep you can have. This is all currently in the land use table, and we've simplified a lot of these uses into and defined them in definitions, and then making the table shorter but easier to use, and making sure that we have each use defined clearly in our land use definitions. So we simplified it with the intent of really streamlining approvals. So now the new table, it does, it looks generally similar to the old table, but with the key change is that each of the uses in the left-hand column will have a related land use definition in Article 9. So in your staff report and in the PowerPoint presentation tonight, we do outline the existing code and where proposed changes do occur. So in general, the land use table has a lot of unique uses. A lot of them are not defined. Our goal as part of this update was to consolidate those uses into clear definitions, and in some cases add performance standards in Article 6, and really clear out that land use table of anything that's not really a use. Right now it has canopies or some non-conforming uses. Those things are addressed in other parts of the code. So you'll notice here these new flags on the PowerPoint. Those are new since the last time you reviewed this section. So since the last time we reviewed, we did add a new use that wasn't in the code before about a commercial kitchen. These are kind of best practices. These are things that we're seeing evolving and don't really fit within a category that we had a land use definition for. So the new draft proposes to add a commercial kitchen to the use table and allow that use in most of the commercial zoning districts. Communal housing didn't exist before. That is a factor that we discussed back in last October. Senior housing also didn't have a definition, but has its own standards in the code, so that is listed. Spaceport was not a use that existed. We've added that. We talked about electricity generation and storage facilities last time as well, and that has been clarified to make that clear that that is a primary use. If you are a large battery storage facility or a solar farm or those kinds of things, that's what's intended by that use. We did some work with wineries and breweries to make sure that those uses also include distilleries, and consolidated those as one definition. Two new pieces that are added to the use table that you hadn't seen before are in relation to restricted retail and restricted personal services. And these are things like vape shops and other kind of uses that tend to have some kind of impacts and might need some specific standards. So these uses are added to the use table, and also a new section of Article 6 is included for these uses to specify the distancing requirements so that there are not too many of these types of uses close to each other, as well as close to other sensitive uses. We've also set some standards for the hours of operation for these types of uses, not allowing them to operate late into the evening. 2-unit dwellings, this was in the previous draft before as well. We're also in conversation with a lot of the other jurisdictions around San Luis Obispo County. There has been discussion about kind of rethinking how we term how SB 9 is implemented and how it's showing up in codes. And some of the neighboring jurisdictions are calling these kinds of units urban dwelling units. The 2-unit dwelling is a little clunky. It carries forward what your existing code has and what a lot of other jurisdictions have done, but it does seem like kind of best practices to call them urban dwelling units because they're not always 2 units. And that law about the lot splits in single family zones is a little bit complicated. So we're considering changing that to urban dwelling units. It's not reflected in the current draft you had today, but wanted to kind of highlight that for you as well. Another new use is a vehicle vending court or a food court kind of temporary use that wasn't in the existing land use table, and we're proposing to add that as a new definition, as well as allowing that as a temporary use. The office professional zone also has a number of proposed changes as well. We talked about last time restaurants changing to allow those with a CUP and not limiting a requirement to have frontage on First. The OP zone is located in a couple of places around town, and it made sense to make that change. 2 other things that we hadn't talked about before are with regard to banks and retail in office professional zones. Those were previously listed as not allowed, which seems like that could be a change. And so those are proposed to be allowed uses within the OP zone where they are currently not allowed. We discussed last time hotels and motels, allowing those with a CUP, and urgent care clinics south of First with a CUP. With regard to the regional commercial zoning district, currently there's a floor area limitation on office uses, which we would propose to remove that 10% floor area limitation on office in this draft. That's a new change that you hadn't seen before. The others, composting facilities in the ag zone, we propose to make that also allowed in some additional zoning districts, C3 and PF, some of the more industrial spaces. RV parks are currently allowed in certain zones with a CUP, and we propose to add those to a couple other zones as well with some additional site planning standards. Oops, sorry. One new change too is with regard to rural recreation and camping. It was referenced kind of hidden in the agricultural zoning district and in the existing code, but it wasn't in the use table. So we've pulled that up to add it to the use table and make it clear, and also proposed to allow it in the POS zone as well. These other changes you've seen before regarding vehicle sales, currently allowed with a CUP in certain zones and a P in certain zones, and those proposed to be a CUP in all those same zones. Theaters allowed in the C1 zone, currently by right, but all the other zones it's allowed with a CUP, and making that consistent with other zones as a CUP. Heavy industrial allowed use is allowed use in most of the more industrial zones. We've revised that to be a CUP to make sure that we've got the kind of performance checks that can come through the CUP process. And then finally, self-storage is currently allowed in the AP and PM zoning districts and conditionally allowed in C2, C3, and M. And the proposed changes to not allow it in AP and PM zoning districts, but retain that CUP in C2, C3, and M districts. And then finally, again, you've seen the bed and breakfast proposed changes and the airport change. The two new was with regard to vehicle vending court, which I mentioned. It looks like we have that twice to allow that as a temporary use. And then last time we talked kind of in detail about what the standards for small and large assembly should be. And rather than basing it on, number of seats or those types of things, we talked with the commission about what really those thresholds should be for what was a really kind of a large scale facility versus the smaller type of assembly facilities that we see in kind of community rooms types of things. So we've split that based on the feedback that we received and some additional research to have a clear definition based on square footage of the kind of larger assembly facility being larger than 50,000 square feet. It's a really large space versus the smaller kind of gymnasiums, multi-purpose rooms, things like that would fit under a small assembly definition. So I'd like to pause there under the uses if it pleases the commission, and take a time for any questions or further discussion.
Thank you. Commissioners have any questions? At this time, go right ahead, Commissioner Koger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple questions and/or comments, Genevieve. Where you started with the zoning table, the chart with the uses and so forth, I assume in the final version there might be a key in that will identify the different initials that we're using and what the words are associated with it. So if somebody sees an ag or something, they know what that means. That would be very helpful, and that wasn't there in this. Just a question. The other question is restricted retail. I assume that does not address cannabis. Is that correct? I didn't see that specifically referenced. I think that's covered in other sections of the code. That's correct.
That is correct.
All right. Comment on urgent care clinics. We're limiting it just to where the one clinic is right now, basically. And I'm wondering if that's enough in terms of locations, or if that's too limiting, you might just look to see if there are any other suitable sites in the community. So I believe the one that exists now is in that location, and there's not a lot of expansion potential. And I think that was all I had for questions and comments on this first section. Thank you.
Can I ask a clarifying question on your first comment about the kind of acronyms?
Yes.
Are you referring to the acronyms that are within the table, like the P, the CUP, or the acronyms at the top that list the zones?
It's
Such
the
as
top
ag.
of the zone, so people know what an RC
Okay.
compared to an RL, compared to a PM, compared to an AP actually is. You can't find that
Yep.
as a reference. So I think it
Okay,
just helped to have a
thank you.
simple key that had the words associated with those.
Great, will do.
Any other commissioners with questions? Commissioner Davis.
Yeah, I too was wondering about the First Street reference with actually more than the urgent care. I think there were a couple of other situations limited to, I think it was south of First Street. And so I guess I'd ask Genevieve this, and I have some other questions too, but what's the rationale for that?
Genevieve, I'm happy to hop in.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Sure.
the Office Professional Zoning District, most of it is located in two spots. One is 12th Street, going up into what feels like a residential neighborhood. The other spot is the gate. It used to be called the Gateway Center, south of First Street, like where there's a Thai restaurant, and then there's the clinic, the health clinic, and there's a hotel, and those are very different areas. And so the reason that there's a lot of call outs is that while a hotel makes sense south of First Street, it doesn't make sense on 12th Street. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of nuances in the OP zoning district in particular. One of the things that we hope to tackle there's been a discussion about expanding the boundaries of the Uptown Town Center specific plan. Staff sees 12th Street as an opportunity to rezone that to T3F, and then the Office Professional, they should be different zoning districts. They're very different areas. Does that answer your question? I don't have that
I guess
impression.
it does. I kind of agree with the comment that I heard from Commissioner Kogler that it seems like we're pretty much limiting urgent care locations in our community, and I'm not sure that that's what we really want to do. So that was one comment.
Commissioner Davis, just so health clinics are allowed in many different zoning districts. The limitation to south of First Street is just in the OP, and that's to prevent medical clinics with lots of customer turnover from establishing on 12th Street.
Okay, so I have to look at the map to know that it's not as limited as one might think.
Yeah, if we look at, I don't know if we have a slide that has the whole table, but clinics are allowed in many different zoning districts, commercial zoning districts.
That helps. And if I could stay with you, Katie, there are a couple other places like the vehicle vending court where, that wasn't in the old and we're bringing it now. What's the rationale? Is that to cover all bases? Is that what Paso Robles wants? I don't understand why it's being recommended. I mean, in the back of my mind, I would think we make decisions that won't jeopardize the vitality of our economic base downtown, but can you talk to me about a vending court and why it's being added?
Sure, and I think, what we're talking about there is a food truck court, and those are, a use that's popping up in different communities. We're getting folks who've come in for applications, and it's distinct enough that when we get a request like that, staff isn't sure, like, where do we place that in the existing zoning code? And so our recommendation is to put it in as a use. If the Planning Commission doesn't feel like we want food truck courts in our community, this is an opportunity to.
Yeah, and Robert, I'd go to you with your Chamber of Commerce background. I know this has somewhat came up when I was the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce, competing with existing businesses. So it's something that maybe we could talk a little bit about. I have some other questions, but I'll hold
Real
those
quick,
for
just back on that.
Yeah.
I think, right now, staff doesn't have any clear direction on food courts or food trucks or whatever. So I think the best way to deal with it is to define it, put it in the ordinance, and then the city can decide whether to prohibit it everywhere or allow it under certain circumstances. So we put it in here. So I think now we've got something that we can actually, have a discussion about as a community about where it may be appropriate. And maybe the decision is we define it and not allow it. That could be an outcome.
Warren, that helps a lot because as I read, especially this first Article 3, and I saw some comments here tonight, was bothersome because it seemed like we were making some decisions that were beyond a user-friendly document, that we were making some significant changes. But you're saying these changes wouldn't be enacted unless there was an ordinance put in place?
Well, this is the ordinance. This is the, this is the workshop. So these, we're getting issues out for discussion. So this is exactly the kind of feedback we want. So if, we want more urgent care, that's what we want to hear. If we want to be more restrictive on food trucks, that's what we want to hear. What we'll do is we'll take that'll get refined into the next draft, and then you guys can debate what's in that draft and then what you want to recommend to the city council. And then the city council, you may tell them, hey, we're really concerned about these types of uses and these issues. Please, give us some additional feedback. And that'll get us to, that final draft that will run through the environmental process and public review.
I just want to follow up to my fellow commissioners. I don't know if you had the similar reaction. We're making some decisions on changes in lot width and reduction in density, and it just seems like it's more than a zoning update or reformatting of the zoning code. I just have some concerns that we don't fully debate something. Is this what Paso Robles wants? I just toss it out there.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Conley, thank you.
Thank you, Ty. Yes, I had the same question about the urgent care, and I would guess that based on your table there, maybe if it had a different zoning, like I'm thinking on the east side of town, there might be a future need for an urgent care, say around Union Road and Golden Hill, or maybe over towards Lene as that develops. So would that be based on the zoning that could be like a C1 or a AP, or I'm a little confused if you're just restricting urgent care to that one location, or depending on the other zoning possibilities, there could be other locations for urgent care.
Absolutely. So Warren's been highlighting the table up on the screen there. So the C1, C2, and C3 are most of our commercial areas, the really kind of retail commercial areas. RC is another one that the regional commercial, that's like the Albertson Center, but most of the other centers are in the C1 or the C1, so forth. AP is, of course, out by the airport. So the commercial zones where it's not currently being proposed are the commercial neighborhood. The CP is a kind of a neighborhood commercial zone. And then the manufacturing zones, we're also not proposing it there. But it's largely allowed in most of our commercial zones.
I was just wanted to clarify, because I could see a need on the east side of town as we develop, that there could be a need for an urgent care on the east side of town, or southeast side, northeast side. So.
Absolutely. And as far as as my memory is, we didn't actually change where it's allowed. This is what it's always been. We did, I think the language in the OP was a little bit different. Genevieve, do you remember? I think maybe urgent care was not allowed at all in the OP. And
Correct.
So we're saying it can be in the OP. We've already got an urgent care center in the OP south of First Street, but everything else was actually kept the same.
Okay. And
Correct, exactly.
on the page 5 at the third from the bottom, regarding restaurants allowed use, I'm not sure I understand what it means, no requirement for frontage on First. Is that First Street? And it is,
That's
could
correct.
you clarify that?
Again, in that oddball zoning district south of First Street that's zoned OP, I believe restaurants are not allowed. We've got a whole chain, there's a whole 3 or 4 restaurants in line right there. Currently, those are not allowed uses. We're just recognizing that we like those uses there and we want them to be conforming with the code.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other commissioners with questions or comments? Questions, Brandon? I have a couple questions, if you've got another minute here. Kind of following up on the acronyms, I was noting there, and maybe this is just me missing something, so bear with me. Development plan modifications, it's mentioned several times in here, but maybe there is a definition, or I didn't see a definition of it. I think maybe clarification on what that means, maybe especially for some of the listeners or people that are going to review this later, but it would be nice to know what they're referring to.
You bet. So that's a subject that we discussed, and we can pull up the dates if that's helpful, but it's in Article 2, if I'm correct, Genevieve. So currently, when projects come to the DRC or to the Planning Commission, they often ask for exceptions to certain development standards. It's not laid out very well in the code what the Planning Commission or DRC today can make modifications on. So the new code acknowledges that in Paso Robles, when there's site-specific reasons for alterations, maybe we want a smaller setback here, maybe we want to allow a little more height. The Planning Commission has certain authority to approve modifications. The DRC has authority for kind of smaller modifications, and some modifications have to go all the way up to City Council. So it is outlined in Article 2. It's obviously not the big focus of this evening, but when we talk about a development plan modification, it's an entitlement that a project would need to seek from a development plan modification would come to the Planning Commission, and it would allow the Planning Commission to consider whether or not they want to allow some sort of variation from what is allowed by code, but what the development standards are.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I think that's important to note. That's why I brought it up, because I wanted to point out, and maybe this is my opinion of it, but it feels like that allows for a little flexibility for the Planning Commission, if you're dealing with a lot that maybe is, an oddball situation, or there's some kind of mitigating factor. So I appreciate that. That's why I want to make some clarification on it. Personal services. I was really curious on, you gave an explanation or an idea for restricted retail. Can you kind of give me one for personal services? I had a hard time with that, and I wasn't really sure if maybe I was missing kind of what that means, to be honest with you.
Yeah, so obviously the things that are for sale are a little bit, with the retail, it's a little more obvious. With the personal services, we would put massage parlors into that category. We are seeing a lot of massage parlors. We don't want to see them necessarily near, schools and tightly packed where there's lots of them close to each other. Genevieve, do you remember what else we put in that category?
I'm going to have to pull up the definition to see.
I think check cashing would be in that category because that's a service.
Check cashing.
Oh, okay. I didn't think of that. Yeah.
I think loan and pawn would go into the personal or retail restricted.
We had check cashing, massage, tanning salons, spas for hourly rental. Tattoo parlors are regulated separately.
Okay. That helps. That gives me an idea of the train of thought behind that. I understand. Another one that I had a question on, communal housing. I know that that's added in, and I guess it's emerging. Are we seeing that here locally? And if so, are we seeing a demand for that type of?
We have not. However, I believe state law now requires us to allow it, at least in some zoning districts. Right.
Okay. Perfect. All right. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Commissioner Davis.
Where would we find the definition? Is that in the last article?
It is in Article 9. It's an attachment to your staff report, but or did it get printed out? It's in Article 9.
Yeah.
And so communal housing would be described as?
It's kind of like more like a dormitory, but it's shared living quarters that do not have separate kitchens within each unit. So there's shared kitchen facilities. So it's more of kind of a communal type living that we're seeing pop up and in various parts around the state, and just kind of getting ahead of that. So it's an allowed use moving forward.
Genevieve, is that a requirement of the state? Was I correct in that?
It is not a requirement. It is really just a trend. So if Paso Robles does not want to see this in your code, we could remove it, certainly.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry. Did you have a follow-up question? I apologize. So then with that, it says, so where does it fit in on the table? And I guess I had that. I thought I highlighted it, but I must not have. So is that, is it allowed in just commercial, specific commercial?
It looks like it's R2, R3,
is that what it's showing up under?
R4, and R5.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
And then just the definition of communal housing is on page 429 of our package.
Thank you.
Way
That was,
near the end.
thank you, Commissioner Neal. I appreciate that. Okay, so back to my questions. I apologize. I got sidetracked. Heavy industrial, can you kind of, it's an allowed use in C3, MPM, and AP. Can you give me your thinking of why? Is it more restrictive going with CUP? I mean, I feel like we shouldn't be limiting that. I feel like we should just have, the ability to have that in more of these zones, but obviously if it fits within the parameters of what heavy industrial really is.
So in our current zoning code, there are many different heavy industrial uses called out, and they ultimately they are largely the same as to impacts to sort of the community. And there was a hodgepodge of which were allowed conditionally, which needed just to come in and get a building or a business license. And so the idea was to lump them all into one category and then to make them conditionally allowed. So I was trying to find the actual definition. So heavy industrial uses include but are not limited to heavy trucking activity, things that include a lot of noise, have a lot of emissions. Oh, I'm sorry, I misread that. So it's activities that have lots of heavy trucking, noise, emissions requiring federal or state environmental permits, uses of large quantities of hazardous materials that the EPA would need to get involved with, requiring specialized permits from federal and state agencies. It includes activities such as processing, fabrication, assembly, treatment, testing, packaging, incidental office storage, and distribution of parts or projects or products. In contrast, light industrial would include things such as it would include industrial manufacturing, but things that don't need all those special heightened sort of permits from, that are.
I guess what I'm saying is, do we feel that the CUP allows for greater flexibility by lumping them? They come in and get a CUP for the property location instead of being kind of cornered into one specific type of zoning. I mean, that's kind of the way I read it, and I just wanted to get clarification if that's what your thinking was.
The thinking was, if you're light industrial, if you have relatively low impacts on, the environment, on the community, you're an allowed use. That's what the P there means. So you're an allowed use in the C3, in the M, in the PM, in the AP.
Right.
We do want, if you need special EPA coverage, if you've got a lot of emissions, you're doing something that's pretty heavy duty, we want to make sure we've got all those permits in place and we've got all the proper permits. Planning Commission looks at all the different, potential impacts and we get a use permit. So you'll see they're allowed in the same zones, but the heavy industrial uses do need that use permit.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that explanation. I'm sorry, Commissioner Davis.
Katie, one more question. Theaters, it's top of the screen there. It was something else I meant to ask. And that includes both live and then the traditional cinema, like our downtown cinema. So that hasn't been changed, or it has opened up areas? I know it has that asterisk without being detrimental to the downtown. I'm going to just be a Main Street proponent here. So explain to me what the change might be there.
Jenna, if you definitely correct me, I believe the only change is to allow it in the C1. It was previously allowed in the CP, C2, C3, and RC, but not in the C1.
I think it was actually allowed in C1, but by right, and everywhere else it's allowed with the CUP, and it just a large use like that. The thinking is that it could use just a little bit of extra oversight with regard to timing of hours of operation, and it could have live or movie performances. So the intent was to keep it consistent throughout all the zones and allow it with a CUP and C1 as well.
And I think an important historical fact is that most of the downtown was zoned C1 before the Uptown Town Center specific plan. So we were trying to allow it in our downtown and maybe restrict it a little bit everywhere else. I think that's also part of the reason that we had that difference.
I appreciate that. I just know that there has been longstanding community sentiment to have live community theater, and I didn't want to restrict that momentum in any way.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis. Commissioner Covarrubias had a question?
Yeah, so I was going to say that, but Katie, I'm going to ask now. So we added this vending court section. Why don't we just call it food trucks? Just curious. Because that's, I mean, really, that's what we're specifically talking about, right? So why are we confusing it by not just calling it what it is? And I guess I would say the same. Where would, and only because it just passed, we had Valentine's Day not long ago, and I must have seen 10, I don't want to exaggerate, 10 different locations where people were selling flowers on the streets. And on occasion, there's a couple, 2 or 3 locations I can think of that people sell fruit on the corners. How are we addressing all of those situations? I mean, we're just calling this vending.
Yeah, so
So,
please, Genevieve, go ahead.
So with regard to the first question about the terminology, and we did actually have it drafted as food truck and kind of internally decided to open it up to, as it's an evolving use, you know, we can see this as different types of vending could occur in this kind of setting. So if you have a lot where you have a lot of different types of vehicles that come and vend different things that are not necessarily food, that could all be lumped within the same thing, with the intent of, right now we're seeing it mostly as food trucks, but we could see it as other types of, you know, flowers or other types of goods that are sold from any kind of vending machine, vending vehicle. That doesn't have to be necessarily a truck, but colloquially it is known as food trucks. We can make that change if you'd like. With regard to the second question about vending, in particular in the public right of way, we're not addressing that with the zoning code because the zoning code is really looking at just what's happening within the public realm. So on the other side of the sidewalk is where the zoning code really starts. So we're not addressing vending outside of that.
So those sidewalk pushcart vendors are a different issue. We're actually in the process right now of adopting a new municipal code regulation for those. So the state has preempted prohibition of those sorts of uses. They're required to be licensed, but as long as they have a license, they pretty much can operate on any sidewalk anywhere in the city. And we're updating the municipal code to reflect that right now. So that's going through second reading at council today or next week.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you for that, Warren. I'm good, Katie. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Covarrubias. Commissioner Marlowe.
Yeah, I'm looking at this table, and obviously you've added some things, and from what I heard, most of the things stayed the same, or but did some change besides the ones you added?
So go ahead.
Go ahead, Genevieve.
So the intent of this summary was really just to highlight where any changes were occurring. The ones that don't say new, we talked about a couple of years ago at the start of the process. These new ones are the new ones that have resulted, and we've consolidated all of the changes that would occur to the land use table as much as we possibly can. There are some nuances that are going to happen because we consolidated different uses into, you know, one larger definition that lumped a few uses. There are some minor nuances within that, but in general, these are the changes that that we've outlined tonight to the use table.
Well, I'm looking at the table itself. You're saying on the, I guess I'm not understanding, because on the table you're saying that I just don't see what's new or what's changed on that table. Like, where does it identify? I was looking at the table that was on the screen, not what's on this screen, but the actual table that you had up before. And I'm having a hard time identifying what was an existing thing on this table versus what's a new thing. And maybe it's pretty clear, but I'm just trying to figure out from this table what was before and what's now, and maybe bolding the things that have changed and then leaving the things that didn't change the normal size. Does that make sense? Or am I missing something?
It does make sense. This is definitely something that we've received public comments about, and we understand it's a frustration. And the land use table, it is largely the same, although we've changed some definitions, we've combined some things together. In general, we are repealing the existing zoning code and we are replacing with what's here. And I understand we want to understand the changes, and we have, you know, the decision has been, you know, what a staff has been doing is not providing the strike-through version, but we are giving you those lists that have the changes.
Yeah. It might be easier to identify the changes if it's like clear on the table, right? Because I mean, going to the definition of the changes and then looking at the table and kind of going back and forth is a little challenging. So for clarity, it might make sense to give us one table with all the zones, what was before, what's not. And then maybe it would be a good idea to have a discussion about that because, you know, looking at the top and looking at what they are, it might be a lot of big exercise, but it might make sense to go through them independently and look at each one for each code. Maybe it falls on you guys, but I think it would make sense just to, you know, this is our opportunity to add and move things around. And there's a lot of information for us to dissect to make all those decisions. And it would be good to be able to go through that thoroughly and objectively. So just something to think about. It would be easier for me to have something identifying what changed on the table specifically.
Okay, thank you. Are the commissioners ready to move on? Any other questions right now? Okay, go ahead, Genevieve. I guess we can continue on with the presentation.
Right, thank you very much. We'll move on to the residential zoning district. So Article 3 also includes those general development standards for each zoning district. What is the setback? What is the height? What are the open space standards? So we'll start with residential zoning districts. And much of this portion of the proposed update is intended to remove some of those extra and sometimes conflicting regulations and really try and simplify this part of the code significantly. But we do also, as was indicated, have a couple of specific changes that we will outline for you tonight for discussion and input as to if you'd like to move forward with that. So starting with the residential agriculture zone, the RA zone, here, this is not applied to too many parcels in town. The changes proposed are really to clean up some of the subjectivity that currently exists around minimum lot size. And to really clarify that the minimum lot size is indeed 3 acres. Right now it says it's between 3 and 10 acres, which could be read in many different ways. And there's some ambiguity about the city engineer allowing various sizes within that zone. So we just wanted to make that clear that set the threshold within what was existing at the low end of what was existing to change it to 3 acres as the minimum lot size in this zone. The second proposed revision is about height in this zone. Throughout the code, the way that height has been looked at, and we talked about this last month when we talked about projections into the height envelope. That's covered in Article 4. So in the past, the way that the code was written, there was a lot of talk about habitable and non-habitable space, whereas with the way that the code is written now, we tried to be really clear about what is the height limit and what is allowed to project beyond that height limit. Before it was kind of, you know, maybe they'll go to DRC to talk about anything above that. And we wanted to be really clear about what are the limits, what's allowed above that, and beyond that, if you do exceed that, what is the process to do that? And that is through that site plan modification or the development plan modification that we discussed before. So the idea here is to be consistent with that change and remove the allowance for 50 feet in this zone for non-habitable space. Instead, allow those projections that we outlined in Article 4 to go above, be they for architectural or elevators or whatever kind of pieces that go above that. And then through Article 2, our modification process would be able to allow something to go even taller, like a silo or something that's a non-habitable space, up to that 50 feet. So really just kind of changing the terminology. We have a process to continue the same standards. Within the R1 district, this is an interesting piece. Current code has some existing minimum lot widths, and they're all kind of tiered based on the slope of the lot. And the smallest that a lot can be wide is 70 feet. And one proposed change is to reduce that down to 50 feet. These existing minimum lot sizes of 70 feet and up would preclude actually the original subdivision of the city. So at some point in the past, the minimum lot size was increased to these 70 feet and up widths, up to 150 feet on slopier lots. So many of the existing lots in the original subdivision have widths of 50 or 60 feet. So we wanted to present this question to the Planning Commission. given that kind of context of the original subdivision, would you like to see the minimum lot width in R1 just removed or reduce as we have proposed here, or see no change in that minimum lot width requirement? And I'd like to pause there. We've got questions on a lot of these slides.
And Genevieve, remind me, we did not actually change the minimum lot size, just the width. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any commissioners have questions on that or comment? Commissioner Covarrubias?
So jumping up real quick, Genevieve, and you're saying in one of the changes from when we addressed the lot size, 3 to 10 acres, you're simplifying it to 3 acres. My question is, the question that states here, minimum lot size. Now the R1 zone or the residential zone, that's residential neighborhoods, right? That's residential communities. Am I understanding that correct? Is that the zoning we're talking about?
So the zone with the minimum lot size of 3 acres is residential agriculture.
Agriculture.
And that's just a small subset of very, very low density residential that also is very rural and allows agriculture as well. So that's a very unique zone. It only applies to a couple of parcels.
Got it.
That's the one that has the minimum lot size of 3 acres.
And that is because it's agricultural related.
Correct. And right now it has a minimum lot size in the code for that zoning district of 3 to 10 acres. But that's confusing because that's not one number. So implementation of that is difficult to read. So we wanted to be clear, be consistent with this. The most allowable minimum lot size is 3 acres and not go to 10 acres, which is also listed in the code.
Okay, interesting. I want to think about that some more. Okay, thank you.
Any other
So
commissioners?
the R1 district is different.
Sorry about that, Genevieve. I didn't mean to step on you.
Oh, not at all. I was just following up that the R1 district is these are the small single family lots that we know.
Commissioner Conley?
Yeah, just to clarify on the widths of the R1, you said the lot size didn't change, but the widths do. Does that mean that the square footage would be the same? It's just the widths you're talking about, so the length would have to be longer? How is that? How does that keep the same size unless the length is longer, or there's a square footage or acreage attached to that?
Yeah, you're right. The dimensions, what you would end up with deeper lots. It's not saying people have to be a 50-foot wide lot. They could go wider, but it just gives more flexibility in the shape of the lot. The reason that staff even recommended this, I live on the west side on a 50 by 140 lot. My lot could not be created today. That's the original subdivision of Paso Robles. And so that was where we got started. And then we just sort of reduced most of them. It's the width, not the lot size. You would still have to have, the minimum lot size in the R1 is 7,000 square feet. And then as it gets steeper, it goes to 10,000 and to 12,500. It gets larger. So those would still be the same.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Any other commissioners?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Marlowe.
I just wanted to understand the thought process by the lot width in regards to the slope. Like what drives that? And I guess it makes sense from a high level point of view, but what's the thought or what's the drive behind slope versus width of the lots?
So, when you put a house on a slope, you end up doing a lot of grading. And so the idea is to decrease the density in our steeply sloping lots. The steeper the lot is, the more elbow room, we want there to be more room for grading, and then also for there to be kind of fewer houses per acre. Oh, and Darren's getting up, but not to come up. I thought he might have more.
Okay, I suppose I understand that. I mean, retaining walls and things of such, like I've built some pretty big buildings on some small lots, but the idea is in the more hilly portions, you guys have a little bit more elbow room to grow. Is that kind of the idea behind it?
Right. Usually we want to restrict, we want there to be, less grading on those steeper lots. And so we want there to be more space, and if you get a really small lot on a steep lot, you're likely to end up with just steeply sloping land to build on. If it's bigger, you might have some more variation in the topography. There'd be a slightly steep building site more typically.
Sure, sure. And then another suggestion is just to put the zoning map in these packages, just so like I have an iPad in front of me, so I pulled it up and was looking at the RA while we're going through it. But just a suggestion, just give everybody else the ability to take a look at that while we're looking through these documents. Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Neal.
So I had a question regarding the change from 50 to, from 70 to 50. Is that saying, and I don't think it is, but is that saying that if someone has a vacant R1 lot that is in the old portion of town, they can't build on it because it's not 70 feet wide?
No,
No,
I'm sorry, Genevieve, we keep doing this. The existing ordinance says as long as you can meet your development standards, you don't have to meet your minimum lot size. We wouldn't create a new lot that would create this situation, but if you have an existing lot, you just have to meet your setbacks, your height requirement, all the standards. As long as you can do that, you can develop.
And we've got that covered under our Article 7 nonconformity. So this would be considered a nonconforming lot. This is really just applying to when somebody was subdividing, they would not be able to have a smaller width than 50 feet if they were to subdivide their lots.
Okay, thank you. Any other, Commissioner Kogler?
Thank you. Sitting here, questions popped into my head that maybe I could answer if I went into the definitions, but go back to the RA for a minute that we were talking about. What is the city's kind of philosophy towards residential agriculture? Is agriculture the emphasis or is residential the emphasis? Because arguably 3 acres is a minimum lot size compared to 10 makes it a little bit more urban, if you will. And I'm putting that in quotes because it's not urban, but it allows you to displace more agricultural land. If your intention is to do that, fine. But if your intention is to preserve ag, that higher number actually may do that more effectively than 3 acres.
So the way that we've currently written and admittedly, most of the existing zoning districts didn't have purpose statements, so we're kind of backing into them a little bit based on what's there today. So the way that it's written is intended to accommodate semi-rural detached single-family dwellings. So it's really intended to be more residential. It does implement some general plan residential suburban and agriculture designation. So it has 2 different general plan designations on it. So it depends on the individual parcel. But I think, Katie, this doesn't really apply to very many parcels in the city.
That is correct. And it's also, we do also have an ag district where it is meant to be purely ag, although you can do residential in the ag zone as well.
Any other commissioners with questions, follow-up questions? So are you ready to move up? Commissioner Neal.
I just think it based on the current definition of the minimum lot size, 3 to 10, it does create a bit of confusion on, well, okay, so what is the minimum lot size? Is it 3, 7, or 10? So I think just getting rid of the 10 acres keeps it as it is, but just adds a little more clarity to what is a minimum lot size for RA.
Thank you. And I also think it's important to note too, as Genevieve said, a lot of this involves properties that pretty much when it's going to be developed, right? So that's another question that I think would always come before this body and the city council. But I think the clarity is important. Is there any other questions from commissioners? Okay, go ahead, Genevieve. We're moving on.
Would it be possible to get a straw vote on this, the questions that we have on these slides so that we have clear direction to bring you next time?
I apologize. I think you did mean to get a response from us in regards to the specifics of this. So I would say we'll start from Commissioner Marlowe. How do you feel about the R1 minimum lot width?
Yeah, I think the reduction's fine. Honestly, I would be okay with no minimum on the lot width based on if someone wants to build a house on a narrow or steeper slope and they want to go figure out how to do that. I don't think that that's an issue because there's a minimum size requirement anyway, so they're not going to have a 5-foot wide lot, so I'd be in favor of this change, but I'd also be in favor of just getting rid of it and, letting people figure out how to build on what they want to do, you know?
And if I might just interject, one consideration to that too is having a minimum does help to preclude flag lots as well, which you just have the access to kind of landlocked parcels.
Could you, I mean,
So just a consideration.
I'm not an expert on a flag lot, so could you explain what that is to me?
So a flag lot kind of looks like a flagpole with the access drive as the pole portion, and then the flag portion kind of sitting behind another lot that is, so it really doesn't have much frontage except for the access drive. So the intent behind what any type of lot width would preclude that, but of course there's ways to just kind of prohibit flag lots as well.
Yeah, so because if it was a 30-foot driveway, that would technically be a 30-foot wide piece of property, right? Not the, or does that count, or does the larger part count? I guess is my question. What's the minimum would be the minimum, right?
And I can't remember if we proposed to change it, but lot width is actually measured at the setback, the front setback line, which on a flag lot is actually back in the flag portion. So these minimum lots widths would actually not preclude a flag lot because of where we measure lot width in Paso Robles.
Great.
Commissioner Conley?
Yeah, I'm okay with the changes. I do understand that the additional slope would require additional width because of the topography and the need to have maybe more rounded grading instead of more like retaining walls. People don't really like the look of retaining walls. It'd be better to have grading and that grading to be rounded and fit into the contours. And so I understand the need for additional width for steep slopes. But I'm in favor of the changes. I don't see a problem.
Commissioner Davis?
You know, I initially was like, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure if I want this change. What's the community want? But Katie, you saved me on this one because I live in the west side too, and there are a lot of lots like that. And so I'm fine with it. Thank you for explaining that.
Commissioner Neal?
I actually don't see a reason for the change. And in fact, it may limit small lot subdivisions as we move forward if we made the change. So smaller lot, width lots. So it may change the streetscape on our subdivisions as we move forward.
Commissioner Kogler?
I would concur with Commissioner Neal's comments.
Commissioner Covarrubias?
Yeah, I don't see any reason for the change, but I do have a clarification question. How does landlocked lots relate to this, if it does at all?
Our subdivision ordinance actually currently requires street frontage for all new lots. When there is an access easement or it's like a planned development where there's like a private driveway where it's been designed to road standards or to more than just a driveway standard, we do allow them. But in general, we don't allow landlocked lots unless they're part of a bigger development.
Great. All right. Again, I don't see any reason for the change. I don't necessarily think it's that bad, but I'm trying to justify it, and I don't see what really the purpose of it is for. Anyways, so.
Okay, I have no problem with the change. I like allowing a little bit of flexibility in being able to work with a developer on that, as long as we retain the ability to control how that ends up. I think that I really don't have too much of an issue with it. I think we should have a limit, but I'm okay with the change myself. Does that answer your question, Genevieve?
I think so. We have 3 reduce as proposed, 1 no minimum, and 3 no change.
I said I was flexible.
Yeah.
And I am too, honestly. I'm not real hard and fast.
So Commissioner Marlowe, I'll clarify, was okay with the changes, but he didn't see a need for any minimum. Commissioner Davis was, I think, okay either way. So good luck with that one.
Yeah.
If that helps you, let us know if you need something else. Otherwise, you go ahead and move on when you're ready.
Okay. All right, I'll have a few more questions for you on the R1 zoning district here. So the R1 zoning district also has you might be familiar with the B combining district, and these B combining districts are intended to provide development standard for some of the larger single family residential lots in the city that are not quite as large as the RA zone. The primary structure on these larger lots has a larger setback than in the standard R1 zone. It's 20 feet for the front setback instead of 15 feet. However, accessory structure setbacks were parallel to the R1 district, and so they were set back 15 feet. So currently in these B districts, the front setback for the accessory structures is less than for the primary structure, and that seemed odd to us. So we proposed to revise that to match the primary structure of 20-foot front setback for accessory structures, consistent with the primary structure. Garage doors are always required to be set back 20 feet regardless, but this nuance seemed odd and we'd like to correct it. There's currently some language specific to RV shelters in rear and side setbacks in R1 districts. Currently, you can go through a CUP process to request a structure to house an RV in your side or rear setbacks. We're proposing to change that a little bit to go through this development plan or major modification process. It'll still go to Planning Commission. We're just trying to keep things in the right buckets of use versus development standards. If we're proposing a change to a development standard, we'd like to see that go through a development plan or major modification process, just to keep things clear of what we're trying to do. So that's the intent behind that proposed change. The third item here about detached accessory structures, the current code says that accessory structures should be located in the rear half of the lot. Here we'd like to allow a little bit of modification to that to clarify really what do we mean by that. What's more important often is that the detached structures are located behind the plane, the front plane or the street side plane of the primary building. We see this often on wider lots with folks wanting to put an accessory structure, you know, maybe they have kind of a wider and more but not quite as deep lot, and they don't have room for a workshop or something behind their house, but they would on the side. And so we've seen some modifications that need to allow for this. So just changing the code to allow for that is the proposal here. And then the fourth item here, of course, all of these are up for discussion, but the fourth item here, we did have some questions for you on as well. And this is about detached accessory structures in the R1 zoning district at large. So the current language says, detached accessory buildings shall conform to the following requirements. The gross floor area shall not exceed 50% of the gross floor area, including the attached garage, of the main building, except by approval of a conditional use permit. So I read that in a slightly different way than staff has read that over the years. But first, like with the RV shelters, we propose to change the way that exception could be processed. Instead of a CUP that could go through a development plan or major modification process. Still goes to Planning Commission, just kind of different buckets of use versus development standards. But the second part is the interpretation of this and how you would like this to be clarified moving forward. So in general, this standard has been interpreted to mean that someone could apply for multiple detached accessory structures as long as any one of those structures doesn't exceed the 50% of the primary structure. It seems to me that the original intent may have been to be cumulative because it does say plural in the kind of start to it, but it's certainly unclear because everybody's kind of read that in many different ways. So we'd like to clarify one way or the other, and we'd like to discuss this item with you further to get the clarity on how you would like to see detached accessory structures on a lot regulated. Would you like them to be limited to half the size of the primary structure cumulatively? All accessory structures on a lot have to be cumulatively less than the primary structure? Or should it be based on an individual basis where accessory structures could actually exceed the size of a primary structure in total, as long as they don't exceed the minimum lot size requirement? So that's the conversation that we'd like to explore a little bit more with you.
Genevieve, are there any other on this section that you're going to want to discuss that, or do you want to address this right this moment? Do you want to feedback?
I think yep, we can stop right here and talk about this one.
Okay.
All four on this slide, but with particular emphasis on the one that we really wanted input on.
Okay, so why don't we do this? I'll just start. Commissioner Kogler, if you want to put your...
Thank you, Chair. Before I vote cumulative, I have a question. How's that for a lead-in? Talk a little bit about the difference between the conditional use permit and the development plan major modification. This came up a little bit earlier this evening. Talk about in terms of notification requirements, in terms of which one is perhaps more stringent or gives the city more control, or whatever term you want to apply to that. If you would just highlight the differences between those, because CUPs have been around forever. Development plan major modification is different language.
The intent is that they function very similarly. So the notification requirements will be the same because you will be going to Planning Commission, you will have a hearing, so you'll have a public hearing notice, and all of the noticing will be the same. A CUP will run with the land, whereas the major modification, I think, will as well. I'm trying to think if there will be any specific difference at all. When I go back through this, I'll do a cross compare to make sure that they are consistent and exactly the same.
If I could jump in just real quick on that. So really, the CUP is going to run with the land. It's something that you're going to, like an auto repair. If there's a problem, you look back 30 years from now, what were the rules? Development plan modifications is really going to change like something that you're going to construct. So we're going to make a change on a setback or something on a building. And really, after we issue the building permit and it's done, it's really done. It's not something that you're going to come back and review 30 years from now, because once the structure's done, it's done. So I think the CUP is really about regulating uses and ensuring compatibility over a long period of time. The exception process is really about allowing construction that slightly deviates from a standard without going through a variance process.
CUP can be revoked too, correct?
Yeah.
All right, we'll start with Commissioner Neal. Your thoughts? For or against?
Yeah, I'm comfortable with the top three. I'm still formulating my response on the final one, and I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm still thinking about the gross floor area. So,
Commissioner Neal. Commissioner Davis has a question real quick. Maybe it'll help you.
Yeah, before we do a straw vote, I just want to make sure we're all on the same plane what an RV shelter means. Is it anything temporary? It is actually a constructed, we've had some of these come before, and I want to make sure I know what we're talking about here.
Yes, this section of the code is really specific about the materials that it's made out of. It is a permanent structure with metal.
Affixed to the primary residence.
It is not attached.
Not necessarily.
Right. Generally not attached. It is generally a detached accessory structure, but parameters for a solid roof and structure are part of it.
So no way intended to be temporary then. Thank you.
Correct.
Any other questions first? There we go. Commissioner Conley?
Yeah, with regard to that fourth item, what is the general size of R1? I would guess if this was a large lot and you had a accessory structure that exceeded 50%, and then 5 years from now they come back and ask for another accessory, and it's a large enough lot, do we go back and review what was already there? I assume maybe we do, but if it's on a larger lot, do we, it seems to me like there should be, and maybe R1 has a maximum size to it, and we should go with the cumulative. But my question is, are there different sizes of R1 lot, and would that be a consideration?
Maybe I can add a little bit here. Darren Nash, City Planner. I think historically, the idea of bringing up to a public hearing these larger detached buildings was just really how the detached buildings went in the yards and how it could impact neighbors, that kind of thing, in our subdivisions, our R1, generally our R1 subdivisions. I don't recall a situation where we've had people wanting to add more and more structures. Those would have to be on larger parcels. Generally, we wouldn't have those, maybe in the Orchard Bungalow, El Dorado Estates area, but still, I don't recall having a situation where we've had property owners wanting multiple detached structures. So we really haven't had to answer that communicative question. It's really the smaller R1 lot that wants the structure large enough to get an RV in that exceeds the height of the zoning code for that zone, coming through a process, notifying neighbors of that situation is generally how this has been used. So if someone then wanted to come in for a garden shed that had a use permit for an RV structure, well, generally they wouldn't have to come back to the Planning Commission for a garden shed, if it seemed reasonable. So I don't think historically we've had any issues with the communicative issue. It's generally been that initial oversized detached structure and how to regulate that, or make sure that it blends in with the neighborhood, doesn't impact the neighbors too much. So I think that process is still here. The question is whether you can keep adding structures, oversized structures, until you get to 50% or come back to the Planning Commission, I think is the question.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Darren. Commissioner Covarrubias?
So clarify for me, Darren, an R1 lot, what's the maximum size?
There is not a maximum.
There is none, right?
Mm-mm.
So I think for me, that's where it kind of confuses me a little bit.
So generally, if you have a huge R1 lot, someone's going to want to subdivide that someday. More than likely, we would get a request for a parcel map to subdivide it into small. There could be some lots that had the original house in the center and a large lot that's oversized. I can't really think of too many. A lot of those have been subdivided up into different neighborhoods. So having a large R1 lot would have been some of the properties in the specific plan areas that are now reconfigured and being developed. So I don't know that that's a specific issue, but it still would be something where this use permit or this modification has the relationship between the accessory building and the primary, not based on the size of the property.
And if I might interject really quick, taking into consideration also that we already have, it would have to fit within parameters. That's what they'd be asking for example, setbacks, location on the lot, things like that. So this would just be the process by which they would go for that type of change. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're good. So just to make sure I wrap my head around so I could make a intelligent decision, at least my vote. If I'm on an R1 zone lot, it is what it is, 15,000 square feet, decent sized lot, and I have a 2,000 square foot dwelling, and I want to add a 1,000 square foot accessory dwelling. Right now, I could add 500 accessory dwellings if I meet the setbacks.
You could add 1,000 square
right.
foot.
Could I add two 500?
If you met the setbacks and heights and things.
I could, right?
Right.
So the question that is being proposed to us is right now is, do we want a cumulative being able to do that, or do we want it to be one accessory dwelling? Correct? So it's either two of 500, one of 1,000.
And let me just I just saw Genevieve just had an epiphany here, so maybe she might be able to answer your question really quick. I know you want to talk, so go ahead. Genevieve.
So it's a little bit, yeah, this one is kind of tricky. So, and I didn't explain it well, I don't think. So the cumulative limitation, so if you had a 15,000 square foot lot and a 2,000 square foot house, and you said you wanted to put 1,000 square foot accessory building and then another 1,000 square foot accessory building, the way that it's currently being interpreted or read would allow that, in effect, to even more than the size of the primary structure. So you could keep using that.
Yeah.
You could iterate on that, right? You could use it over and over. Or is it, like you said, 2 500s or one 1,000 all within that one cumulative structure? And that's the question I was trying to get to, because right now there is a 50% maximum lot coverage. So you can only cover half the lot. So that's going to constrain you in addition to your setbacks and other things. But it's really about how do we read this? Do we allow people to iterate on that? If you have a really small house and you don't want to add to it, and instead you want a really large accessory barn structure, are we okay with that? And do we want to just make that really clear? Or do we want to be really clear about the fact that the intent of this is that the primary structure is the primary structure and accessory structures should be subordinate?
Thank you. Commissioner Covarrubias, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but did you want to follow up on that?
Well, again, I've said this many times, simple, easy language to understand is better, right? I think sometimes we try to overcomplicate it with words that aren't necessary. I mean, if we want to cap it and say, the maximum is 50% of the gross floor area, and then determine, is it a cumulative or just a one dwelling scenario, then I think we word it that way. Keep it simple, because right now the way we're trying to explain it, I mean, you can already see all the questions that are being asked because we're just trying to understand it, right? And I think the general public is struggling with the same thing, hence why we keep getting these letters about not being able to understand the codes and how they read. I think we try to overcomplicate it by trying to cover all of our bases, and we're trying to simplify it by adding things, but we're still complicated because the choice of structure of the definition is still confusing. So in this case here, I'm not sure if I'm agreeable to a cumulative or call it a one accessory dwelling scenario, because it's hard. I mean, I hate to limit a property owner. It's their property as long as they meet the guidance. So right now I'm going to say cumulative. I think it'd be okay to allow somebody to have more than one accessory dwelling if they meet the guidance. And if the guidance is 50% of the gross floor area, but it would have to be 50% of the gross floor area, in my opinion, total. So they, like you said on the scenario before, 2,000 square foot home, I wanted to add 1,000 square foot accessory dwelling. You said by current code, I could actually add another 1,000 square foot dwelling if I met all the setback requirements, right? What I'm saying is that's what we're trying to figure out if we want to limit.
Right.
But and just a clarification too, she's also in this, I think what's important that might be getting a little bit missed and maybe not, but it's important to note what they're doing is she's proposing the change from a CUP as the process and instead development plan as the process. And that's an also important factor to that. And I'll stop there. And I know Commissioner Neal wanted to say something.
So I do have a question on the definition of accessory structure. Is that an ADU or is that a non-habitable space? Because if it's an ADU, then I think we may have some problem with the current SB9 or whatever. But if it's not a dwelling unit and it is just a barn or a storage or a garage, then I have probably a different opinion of it than a dwelling.
This does not include accessory dwelling units. The state law really precludes those, and we're really talking about your workshops, your barns, your garage, your detached garages, those structures.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Neal. Commissioner Conley.
I'm just curious how this would trigger. If I had a 2,000 square foot house and I wanted to put an accessory structure that's, say, 600 square feet, it wouldn't trigger. And so I could build that. I guess I'd have to have a building permit. So then maybe 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years down the way, I decide I want another 600 or 500 square foot accessory building. How does that get triggered that now you're over 50%?
And that is the question. Go ahead, Katie.
No, I did exactly what you said. So that's the question we're asking. So today we would treat each structure separately. Each one can be up to half the size of the residence. Staff is recommending and we're asking whether or not you like the idea of all of the detached barns, garages, all of those get added.
Well, my question goes farther than that, is how would it be triggered? I mean, if you never have to go before planning commission because you never, and that building permit never exceed 50%, how does it get triggered?
So when we get a building permit in for a detached accessory structure, it gets routed to a planner who looks at it, and the planner would look at the site and see, oh, there's a lot of structures on here. They'll go and they would add up. They'd look at building permits. How many square feet do we have here? So when we received a building permit application, that the planner would see, and that we would identify that, oh, if you want to do this, you need this special modification.
And that would be done?
Correct.
Okay.
Commissioner Covarrubias.
Katie, just clarity. If I want to add a 10 by 10 garden shed,
You can go all the way to 10 by 12, Rob, 120 square feet.
no, with no permit, right? So does that garden shed count against my total?
I think it's a good question. When you read the way it's written, you don't need a building permit, but you are supposed to meet all of the zoning standards. You're not supposed to go taller than 15. You're not supposed to be closer than 3 feet to your property line. So, I mean, I think a strict reading would say that would get counted, but we could, it's a good question. But yes, and to some degree, do we really want to allow a million 10 by 10 structures? It seems like they should count if they're covering up, portions of the lot, but it is a good question.
So right now, do we allow it?
Right now, we treat each structure separately. So we only look at the one structure and how big it is in relation to the primary residence.
But that was the discussion, I think, at your last meeting, was to limit those structures. So if you had a limit on those, you knew you could only have like 3, that's 300 square feet max, then you kind of know how big that potentially could before you started counting all these other structures on the site.
Okay.
Any other commissioners' questions, comments?
Just a comment. I know we're making some, we might ask for a straw vote, but there might be some people in the room who might have comments on this that might help us make some decisions. I'm just wondering when they'll have an opportunity to speak.
I know. Well, I was waiting for public comment because we had so many items to still cover.
And I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying I think some of these maybe.
I was thinking of that on the last one too, and I thought, well, I just didn't know.
I just wanted to bring that up.
I guess we could take a brief pause here and see if there's any public comment on this particular item that we're discussing. Go right ahead.
Hi, Tony Gaspar, 2200 Country View Lane. So that number 4 item that you're discussing is something I dealt with on my property. So I have a 1 acre property, 4,000 square foot house with garage included, and I wanted a 2,300 square foot shop, right? Only a little bit over the 50%. So I went through the CUP process. Not a big deal. You go through it, everybody gets noticed. The city allows you to do it because it wasn't objected to and it fits on your property. For me to then go a year later and say, I'd like another 1,500 square foot property or a building on my property, which is less than half of my 4,000, would be what you're really discussing. You guys don't want to just allow us to do that. You don't want us to just every time come back to you and say it's below 2,000 square feet, it's entitled. So this number 4, it should be 50% cumulative, 50% of the cumulative square footage of your main structure. So I'm over it, but I got special permission. So if somebody wants to come back to and build another building, it should not be allowed automatically. We should have to go through that process. So thank you for listening, and I appreciate all your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Anybody on the line that might want to comment, Marcy?
No callers.
Okay. All right. Bringing it back to the commission, close public comments on that. Go ahead, Commissioner Cover.
So Katie, under Tony's example, right now, if he's just over the limit based on guidance, but he got a CUP, got it approved, nobody objected, he built it. If he came to us for another 1,200 square foot dwelling, we wouldn't look at the existing dwelling, correct, right now?
Staff's interpretation has been we look at each structure separately, and
Right.
we're asking, is that the wrong interpretation?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Tony says it's wrong.
Right. Okay.
And if I might say something too, we had a project recently over in Sherwood. It was a larger building. It did come up in a comment that there was another smaller structure there. And I believe that the consensus was that we wanted that to be moved out because the building was so much larger. So just wanted to remind commissioners of that as well. Do we have any other commissioner comments? Commissioner Marlowe?
Yeah, no, I would agree entirely. I think that the commission has been pretty reasonable. If someone's got a really large lot, they've already exceeded their 150%, I think if it fits the plan and it's not going to impact people, it's their property, I think it's been pretty easy for us to approve things, if they wanted a second one. So I think that the one item, we've had multiple garages recently that were over 50%. We approved all of them, right? And actually one that was in front of the building, but it was one of those private drives. So I think that I would say you get 50%. And if you want to go over, you ask for permission. And if you want to do a second one, you ask for permission again. And on a case-by-case basis, it makes it pretty easy. I think it's actually pretty simple. You get 50%. Do we want to limit to 150% or just 50% total? Because do you get to do 2,500, I guess would be the only question that I would have. But as far as I'm concerned, yeah, 50% is the number. If you want more, you got to ask. Now the question is that 50% for multiple units, or is that you get 150% building and anything beyond that you got to ask, right? So that would be my next discussion point.
Any other comments, or do we want to take a straw poll? Thank you. I think a poll's a good idea. So we'll start with you real quick because you just finished your comment. So let's start with you for the straw poll, Commissioner Marlowe.
I would say limit it to 50% of the building, and I would probably say one building at 50%, and then if you wanted to do any additional buildings, you would have to get approval.
Commissioner Conley?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a limit, and I would suggest that it be cumulative, but my concern is that if it's less than 50% on the first one, that there'd have to be some type of monitoring system so that the second unit, if it was less than 50%, that there would be some type of monitoring system that would catch that and say, now you're 50% or you're over 50%. So I would be in favor of a cumulative calculation with a system that monitors that for those that are less than, when the first one's less than 50%.
Commissioner Davis?
I'm glad you spoke up, Tony, because I remember yours coming forward. I'm kind of torn in this. I kind of want it to be simple. I kind of liked your idea of 50% and with one structure, and if you wanted more to come back, but it seems like that's what we already have. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think the difference would be if you have already gone over 50%, basically any additional structure is going to need a conditional use permit, or it would be a major modification. But so once you've built one large one, now you're over that. So if I want to do something small, I'm coming in for a modification.
I think that would be the way to go then. Thank you.
think that's similar to yours.
Okay. Commissioner Covarrubias?
No, I was going to say, I like the cumulative idea, but I would, again, make sure it's cumulative to 50% total. So if you've got 2,000 square feet and you want to add 500, you're fine, as long as they meet all the setback and the height requirements. If you want to add one for 1,000, you're fine. But I think that's the easiest way to simplify it, in my mind. And then I'd be fine with that.
Commissioner Kogler?
Cumulative, I would not specify that it has to be 50%. It could be smaller, and I think we have review mechanisms in place when somebody comes into the city staff for review that it's picked up. It's on site right now. So I do like cumulative.
Thank you. Commissioner Neal?
As do I. Cumulative.
Thank you. And I'm in agreement with my fellow commissioners here on the cumulative. I think I'd be okay with that. I think that helps specify. And then for anything additional, they're going to have to come through. And I'm okay with the development plan modification process, to be honest with you. And I'm okay with that for the others as well, the development plan modification. Any other final, Commissioner Kogler?
Just one quick question, and it's real simple and quick. We're talking RV shelters here. The last time we talked about other vehicle shelters. Are those in here or are those coming back? If you recall the picture of the canopy over the driveway with the car under it.
I do. And so now that we've got clarity on this piece, actually, that'll help us a lot with that piece. So I think that'll be a topic for us to highlight next time when we bring back the entire code, and you can see how the regulations in Article 3 relate to those in Article 4, and we can get some additional feedback on those final recommendations and how they all fit together.
Thank you. Say no more.
Thank you. Okay, I think that answers your question, Genevieve, for now, hopefully, so we can move on. Perfect.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I think there's one more in the single family zones. These are the most complicated, and we really did a lot in the single family districts to really kind of carve it all out and make it as simple as possible while retaining the intent of the zoning district. A couple of things that we do propose to remove. One of the standards currently lists that all dwellings have to have a minimum width and depth of 24 feet. That would preclude some manufactured housing types and products, and we propose to remove this limitation in particular. Another requirement right now is about second story setbacks. We wanted to make some modifications here just to make it a little bit more simple. But there are some modifications, so I wanted to highlight them for you. So right now, lots that are 65 feet wide or less have a 5-foot setback on either side. If a lot is more than 65 feet wide, you're required to have a 5-foot setback on one side and a 10-foot setback on the other side. It doesn't say which side, but you're required to have a larger setback on at least one side of your lot. Now, the second story is required at all times, regardless of your lot size, to be set back 10 feet. So that can effectively, on a lot less than 65 feet, require a setback of an additional 5 feet because that only has a 5-foot setback. So it could kind of create a wedding cake kind of look, or an applicant could choose to set the entire building back to the 10-foot setback, even though the ground floor is only required to go to 5 feet. On a 65-foot or wider lot, that 10-foot setback is already there on one side, but one side would have to have the second story setback. It is a little bit complicated. In order to make it more simple and just be clear, we do propose to remove that second floor additional setback and just have the setbacks that are regulating on the ground floor to eliminate that kind of wedding cake kind of look. And then second, or third on this slide, actually, is right now there's a minimum building separation. So all buildings have to be set apart 10 feet in the R1 zoning districts. This is larger, this is a greater amount of building distancing than I see in most zoning codes. So we are proposing to reduce that to 6 feet. So your accessory dwelling not your accessory dwelling, but accessory structures would be reduced to a 6-foot building separation requirement instead of 10 feet. And so that is the larger conversation that I'd like to have here, but of course, anything on the slide is open for discussion. But the key question there is about the building separations. I do know that we've had some modifications, and this will come up in multifamily as well. But right now in single family, to retain that 10-foot separation between buildings or reduce it to 6 feet.
Okay. Commissioners? Anybody have any questions or discussion on that? Commissioner Covarrubias.
So Genevieve, just clarity, when you have a second story unit, and I get the setback, does that setback include the balcony or deck? So if you've got a second story building, right? And then you got, say, a master bedroom up there, and you want a deck off your master bedroom slider, is that deck included in the setback equation?
That's a really good point. I would need to look at, I know we allow it a rear balcony to encroach into the setback. I do not believe that the side setback allows an encroachment, but I'm going to have to go and look at our Article 4 to confirm that.
Okay, so the question you're asking is, should we remove the setback altogether anyways, correct?
To remove the second story
additional setback. Right.
Correct.
That's the question. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Commissioner Davis?
Genevieve, and again, we're talking about minimum building separations are 10 feet. That's what's currently there. That means 10 feet between two different parcels, not on an existing lot, correct?
No, I'm sorry, I misspoke. That is 10 feet between buildings on the same lot.
On the same lot, I'm glad I asked. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you.
Commissioner Conley?
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think with regard to second story, it becomes more complicated to have a different setback. So, and I don't really like the wedding cake look. I think from my point of view, it'd be better if they just had the same requirement of setback as a single story. If you have a large lot, but you have topography and oak trees and other things that cause you to move your lot as close as possible to one property line to avoid environmental impacts or to avoid additional grading. I really think that removing this second requirement for a second story is a good thing, because if you have a large lot and you're trying to avoid those things, or you have maybe a medium-sized lot and still trying to avoid those things, you won't. Sometimes you're up against a neighbor who could have a house 25 feet away. So I don't really see the need for a separate requirement for two-story. That's my opinion.
Commissioner Marlowe?
Yeah, so I agree. I think that having different setbacks on stories doesn't make sense, and it should be universal. That being said, you got a development with a bunch of lots that are 65 feet or less. You got two-story building, 5 feet, fence, 5 feet, two-story building. They could really stuff them in there like a lot of buildings like sardines. Maybe that's what we need in Paso. I like to see a little bit more space, so maybe a 7-foot setback. I'm not saying that that's the answer, and I'm not saying that this would happen. I would like to see avoiding just like a development with just building, like, you're looking out your bedroom window and you're just staring at the side of a wall and it's only 10 feet away, and then you got that repeating through an entire neighborhood. So I'm in favor of removing it. I think 5 feet might be a little under, but I think overall, if the other commissioners think that that's appropriate, I would be in support of that. And I think reducing the distance from 10 feet to 6 feet is fine. I think that's totally okay. And removing the requirements for a minimum width and depth of 24 feet. People are moving into smaller and smaller homes. And so.
Thank you. Commissioner Kogler?
Just a question. I assume 6 feet meets all fire codes?
Correct.
Yes.
Anything? Commissioner Neal?
I mean, I understand the reason for the 10-foot setback. I think it was to provide a little more articulation on our building facades, and I can absolutely see where that would be helpful and not have these cookie cutter, single story or single facade designed homes. But that being said, I am comfortable with removing it. I'm comfortable with the other changes on this slide.
Thank you. I'm comfortable with the changes as well, this is Chairperson Christensen. Commissioner Davis?
Yeah, I guess I am too. I know when we're talking about larger buildings, and I think it's usually in a commercial context, we're worried about the mass. But, for a single family residence, I think I'm fine with this as well.
Okay. I think we're good. Commissioners are good. We'll move on. Thank you. Go ahead, Genevieve.
Great. Okay, this one might be the last one for residential. So we've got a couple more items for discussion on this one for single family. A lot of state law has been focusing on objective standards. We've talked a lot about our objective standards for multifamily. Staff was also seeking some more direction in the code for single family dwellings, while it's not being directed by the state. So we do have some proposals in the draft before you that would add 3 additional objective standards to really kind of just address basic quality of design in new single family dwellings. And we tried to keep it very kind of basic and think about the things that really go a long way towards design without really guiding anyone in a particular direction. And the first is to require a porch as a focal point, either at least 6 feet by 4 feet in dimension. And that can be recessed or projecting. It's not currently allowed to project into the setback, however. But a porch can really do a lot to a front facade that is really flat and provides that depth, those shade and shadows that give that intrigue and are appealing to the eye. The second standard that's proposed is to require windows on the front and street side facades. So that would be a glazing equal to 10% of the facade. And that a few windows on a facade can really go a long way. And then finally, we've added some clarifications on roofs, requiring a pitch of at least 3 to 12. And applicants can apply for a site plan modification to go against these standards, and they'd go through a DRC review. But these are the standards that we would like to put out there to really guide single family design so that we don't get some really blank facades. And so we'd like to discuss these new parameters that are proposed with the commission.
Thank you. Would any commissioners like to start? Do they have any comments? Commissioner Conley.
Thank you. I just have a question on the 4x6. Wouldn't it be easier just to have, say, 24 square foot? Does that mean that it's in a certain orientation where the 6 foot would be the dimension that went along the plane of the building or the residence, or could it be 6 feet projected out and 4 feet wide, or either one? If it's either one, why not just say a minimum 24 square foot porch? But I'm not sure what the dimension means, if it means a certain plane or orientation to the residence, and that's why you have 6 by 4.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the idea behind it, we did kind of parallel some of the things that are in the multifamily objective design standards here. And some of the ideas behind a minimum dimension are, unfortunately, I do always think about how this can be gamed to avoid the standard. So if I were to have a 24-foot wide building and do a 1 foot wide porch, which is essentially just a larger eave, that would defeat the purpose of the standard, but might be able to meet the intent of a 24 square foot porch. So the minimum dimensions are there for that reason, to force it. But to your point, it is allowed either way to allow for that flexibility. But really intending to be a minimum dimension of 4 feet in any direction, we could say, and a minimum square footage of 24 square feet.
Any other commissioners? No? All right. Commissioner Covarrubias, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so I guess to answer Genevieve's Question, I would be okay with the windows. I think windows are fantastic. Roof, same thing. I think that's a great idea. The porch thing, I'm a little bit not sure of, only because I think of my own dwelling. I don't have a quote unquote porch. I have a arched entry type situation. So when you say porch, I think of a traditional porch. Is there different definitions of the word porch?
There are, and it can be recessed. So an arched entryway with a recess is also allowed if your front facade has, if your building actually goes out further, but you're kind of have a door well, that would count as well. So it could be, that's what we're calling a recessed porch versus a projecting porch, which would go past the front plane of the building. And we'll have some graphics in there as well that can show those examples.
Okay. All right. I'm not sure about the size limitation or requirement. Yeah, I guess I wouldn't be opposed to some type of nice, entry, porch covered, recessed, whatever, just to keep some type of, I think the intent here is to create a visual, something that's visually complementing, gratifying, so to speak, right? So we don't have a bunch of flat fronts, flat roofs. Okay.
And we did toss around the idea of, instead of using porch, to do some sort of like an entry, or in the Uptown Town Center specific plan, we talk about frontages. So if porch is, that word is, is problematic, we could certainly, switch it. And maybe that's not your concern, but, if it's not a traditional porch, I think we would certainly consider some sort of embellished entry that makes, that embellishes and has those dimensions. That's our intent.
Well, thank you for that, Katie. Only because, again, back to my simple sometimes is, if I'm a reader reading this and I see the word porch, typically I think the reader is going to automatically assume a certain type of porch, traditional porch. So I think that's the only concern I would have.
Commissioner Kogler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, Genevieve, don't ever apologize for putting yourself in the mindset of thinking how people might game the system, because that's the expertise you bring to this whole process, so we want to hear that. I looked at these initially, and I was troubled by the word porch, and maybe there's a workaround for that, but I like the concept of all of these. I was also troubled by the brand here, no flat roofs, because I think in certain cases flat roofs do work and should work, but I assume that can be handled through the site plan modification, and by far, most houses will be in the other roof categories rather than flat. So I think conceptually, I'm okay with all of this.
Commissioner Neal.
Just because I'm sometimes a planning wonk, it looks like new urbanism is alive and well in Paso Robles. But I think the only thing I have is that effectively, if we see a porch or projecting covered area, it does essentially push the house back away from the setback. So now you've increased the setback. So that would be my only concern there. And then I'm also not a fan of the no low slope roofs.
And we did discuss whether or not to allow porch projections into the front setback. It was in and then it was out, and then because for that exact reason. One thing that staff was, I don't know that concerned is the right word, but state law does now allow any basically space to be converted into an ADU, and so then we gaming the system again, just always trying to think one step ahead. We were concerned about that now we would end up with an ADU. Someone would enclose the front porch and now it becomes an ADU. Maybe that's not worth worrying about, but that was why we didn't end up allowing porch projections into the front setback, but it could certainly be brought back.
I'm just worried that everything will be on a single plane with a recess to get to that setback if that is what happens. So I'm not going to throw myself around the bus on this one.
Commissioner Conley.
Thank you. The way this reads, it says provide a 6 foot by 4 foot porch. If I wanted a 10 foot by 4 foot porch, I might read this to say, well, I can't do it because it has to be 6 feet by 4 feet. So I think what your intent is, this is a minimum, or And if it's a minimum, maybe you should say it should be a minimum of 24 square feet, minimum 4 feet wide, so that it allows for flexibility. The way this reads now, it doesn't say minimum. So that's just my point. The other concerns, I'm totally for. It looks good for me.
Thank you. Commissioner Marlowe.
Yeah, I would echo Commissioner Connolly's statement. Minimum square footage with like a minimum one dimension side, because someone wanted a 5x5 porch, right? That seemed like that'd be fine. And then I everything else is fine with me. I think low slope roofs are okay. I would say maybe not included in the setback calculations, because I think that you're going to be pushing things back. And besides that, I think it's all reasonable.
Commissioner Davis.
I'm fine with all three. I do like having the minimum of 24 square foot, whatever the dimension might be. Genevieve, if you could just answer is the 10% kind of standard in zoning for windows? I mean, I like the fact that we want to have some intrigue in the front of the, is 10% minimum kind of standard in the industry?
Yeah, it's a pretty low standard. We want to make this attainable, but also just have a standard. So we have kind of tested it in a variety of different things. If you have, a divided light window as your door and a picture window, you've got 10% easy on a smaller single family dwelling. But we've got standards for glazing and transparency in our multifamily developments, and those are, I think the lowest is 15% on upper stories there. So we're being a little bit more generous here. We want to set a standard and see how it goes too, but didn't want to be too onerous to start out.
Yeah, it looked to me kind of low, but that was my initial impression. I'm not a fan of flat roofs, so I like how this reads with no flat roofs. So those are my comments there.
Okay, this is Chairperson Christensen. So, in my opinion, I'm comfortable with 10%. I'm comfortable with the roofs. I'm not comfortable with the wording on the 6x4 porch, and I feel like we have to, in my opinion, kind of along the lines. Maybe it wasn't along the lines of Commissioner Neal's comments, but in the sense of I understand the purpose of having a more detailed facade on the front and creating that definition. But I'm not sure that we should have to specify that it's a minimum of 24 square feet. I'm not sure how to word it per se, but I'm reluctant to also, not allow for more of, say, a recessed door with a small overhang arch. I mean, I feel like we've got to have a little bit more flexibility in that. And I do think that when those come before DRC and a planning commission, I like that we have some say in that. It is great to have the guidelines, though. Don't get me wrong. Having something a little bit more along those lines where there has to be some detail to the front of the home. Maybe I'm not the right person to ask how to word that architecturally, but I feel limited by the 6x4. Definitely don't like the word porch as the defining definition. I think we have to allow, in this day and age, a little bit more room for people to design, their fronts to these homes that maybe don't include patio or porch that's mandated by a square footage or size. So that's my opinion on that. Commissioner Neal had a follow-up question.
One follow-up, and I guess what I'm reading is it doesn't really say front.
Good point.
Did I miss that?
No, you're right.
And I'll have to double check if we have that correctly in the actual code, which I really hope we do, but I think I simplified it too much in our presentation here.
So, understandable, but that's a good point. That's the eagle eye down at the end over there. He would definitely see that. So thank you, Commissioner Neal. Okay, so are we okay with that, Genevieve? Are you okay moving on?
I believe so.
Okay.
I think I have direction out of that.
Okay, perfect. We can always bring it back when we go over the whole, it could be one of those very important ones that comes back. So go ahead, I'm sorry.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, jumping into multifamily development standards. And this wasn't as much, I don't have as many questions on these ones. The residential one was really quite the overhaul because there were so many different pieces and having to put it all back together. With multifamily development standards, we had a couple of proposed revisions. Back when we were doing our stakeholder interviews, our community member interviews back at the beginning of the process, we talked to community members, developers, architects, residents about any existing constraints. And we also heard, I think this in the HCOC conversations, the minimum storage space in multifamily zoning districts has been brought up a few times. That 250 cubic feet. And so the proposal here is to reduce that to 150 cubic feet. This is closer to the size of a bicycle locker, for example. So you could fit a bike, fit a bike in there. In the mixed use overlay, actually, it is 200 cubic feet. And here we're proposing to reduce it to 150 cubic feet for all multifamily dwellings, be they in the mixed use overlay or in multifamily zoning districts. So that's one proposed reduction coming out of feedback from our community engagement. Here on minimum building separations, in the multifamily districts, they get quite complicated, actually. They're up to 20 feet if you are a 3-story building. If it's a 2-story building, it's 15 feet or something like that. It gets pretty complicated, and it's all based on height. We'd like to simplify that and just say across the board, we'd like to reduce that building separation requirement to 10 feet, and be clear about it that can be, kind of 2 main buildings or also accessory buildings, but really just simplify that to say that buildings can be 10 feet apart rather than up to 20 feet apart if they're 3 stories tall. We also looked at the open space standards. Oops, I apologize. We looked at the open space standards with the intent of trying to clarify and make this as easy for staff to implement, for people who are applying to understand and calculate. So we propose a few changes within here, one of which is actually very slightly reducing the open space requirement from 375 to 350. It just simplifies the math and makes it a lot easier. We also proposed to just make it kind of a little bit easier and more flexible. Right now, there's an incentive to provide private open space. So if you provide private open space, it actually counts 1.5 times in the value of a shared open space. So that's another kind of complication that makes the calculations a little bit difficult, and it's really incentivizing private open space, which we could make qualifications on whether we want to do that or not. Currently, the open space standards also kind of punt on senior housing, but we'd like to set a standard. So right now it basically says you don't have to provide any. It kind of just says planning commission will decide, but here we'd like to set a standard, really making it at least 200 square feet per unit. Could be either private or shared open space, and make that just like a clear standard rather than leaving it up to the planning commission's discretion. I think the intent is to not require them to have the playgrounds that are currently required, but we wanted to just kind of clean that language up and make it clear. There were a couple more on playgrounds, so I'm going to skip to the next slide as well. Right now, there's kind of a table in the code that says, based on the number of units that you have in your multifamily development, you're required to provide a certain number of tot lots. And this has come up on some projects where they'd like to actually provide one large playground that's more multifunctional and appeals to different ages rather than 3. But the code doesn't clearly allow for a mechanism to do that. So we wanted to make that clear that that can be allowed as long as you're providing as much equivalent playground equipment as 3 tot lots would be within one larger playground. That would be allowable. We also added a requirement to require shade over those playground areas. Currently, there's no language on rooftop open space, and we wanted to make clear you're allowed to do rooftop private open space, and shared rooftop open space can be allowed. There is a standard right now requiring residential fire sprinklers. That's building code. We don't need to have that here, so we are proposing to remove that. And then finally, we do have that detached accessory structures question again coming back up. Here, we don't have a lot of detached accessory structures in these multifamily developments, especially the larger ones. We would see it somewhat more on smaller developments. Say you have like a 4-unit structure or a small kind of cottage development, we would see these detached accessory structures. So we propose right now, it talks about anything that has 10 or fewer units. Detached accessory structures are limited to 50% of the main structure. We'd like to reduce that threshold. We think this is really only kind of happening in the smaller developments of 4 or fewer units. And then we'd like to make that same clarification to cumulative that we made in single family. Of course, this one also is available for an exception through the development plan modification process as well. I believe that, I have 2 more on multifamily. Right now, there's no minimum lot size in multifamily zones. We do propose, just for clarity and consistency in the code, to add these minimum lot sizes of 10,000 in R3, 15,000 square feet in R4, and 20,000 square feet in R5. We do also reference, there is a new government code section implemented by SB 684, which does allow small lot subdivisions within multifamily. So that would override any minimum lot sizes. And so we've got that reference right in there in the code so that folks and staff and everybody implementing and reading the code know that is also there. With regard to setbacks, we also wanted to simplify detached accessory structures and kind of parallel what's happening or what's allowed in single family zones, in multifamily zones. The current code is much more restrictive on detached accessory structures for multifamily zones, and especially for our R2 zone, which actually has a lot of single family development in it. We'd like to parallel what's allowed in the single family zones and the multifamily zones with regard to setbacks for detached accessory structures. And then also with regard to adjacent to R1 districts, the setback for an accessory structure is 20 feet. And we'd like to clarify that the setback for anything adjacent to R1 is 20 feet for the second stories and above. And that's consistent with how we are looking at those transition zones. We did a lot of work around that for the objective design standards for the multifamily objective design standards. And so this parallels that, those objective standards, design standards for detached accessory structures as well. And that should be it for multifamily. I could pause there and see if there are any comments or questions that you have on these proposed changes in multifamily zones.
Yeah, that's a good, let's pause because I've marked a few areas where we might have some, you might want some feedback and questions on that. Mm-hmm. Are any commissioners wanting to mention anything at this point? Commissioner Kogler?
Wow, that was a lot, actually. There's only really, I think, a few things in here that gave me concern. Most of the things I could probably say, yeah, I'm kind of okay with that. Question, first of all, on the storage, have multifamily district residents reduced their interest in keeping stuff by 40%? And in the mixed-use overlay of those folks decided 25% less is okay? I say that somewhat facetiously because every time we review one of these multifamily projects, we talk about storage space and we talk about, okay, if you don't have that, people are going to put their bikes and their stuff on the decks, and then we hear a management person say, well, we're not going to allow that. So it's kind of like, where are people going to put the stuff? And I'm just concerned that that reduction doesn't reflect the way people live in the real world today, and I question whether or not that's appropriate. I'll just run through, I only have a few quick things. In the discussion about other non-residential zones, there's a section on height limit of 50 feet for non-habitable buildings. There's a reference there, and there's a subsequent reference to defer to projections section. What is that? Is that its own section, or is that a section within each of the zones themselves? I looked and quickly and I couldn't find projection section.
That is, that's in Article 4. That's the height projection. So that's the projection into the height envelope beyond the maximum allowable. And
Gotcha,
so
okay. In that
those were
context, I
ones we talked
understand
about.
what that means. Okay.
Yeah.
And then I had one last question on areas where we allow private open space. Is that required to be that use in perpetuity? Is there a deed restriction or something that mandates that that be open space and can't be changed later?
What we typically see with private open space is a little fenced yard or a patio of some sort, so it's kind of clear where it belongs. But no, we don't drive around making sure that no fences have been taken down and that, you know, people's private space has been kept private.
Yeah. Commissioner Neal.
I'm a little hazy on the detached accessory structures are limited to 50% of the gross floor area for buildings with 10 units. So does that mean buildings with more than 10 units can have more than 50% accessory structures?
In theory, yes, but we really just don't see that. If you have more than 10 units, we are getting larger buildings, and they're really trying to maximize space for units. And we just don't see that accessory structure issue coming up as much.
Okay. And then I think a while ago we had a project on Creston that was a 6-unit, I think, and it had detached garages. Sadly, I don't think it will be built because the property's for sale. Would that be impacted by this? Because I think that was a pretty well-reasoned project. Maybe a little expensive for the developer, but I guess I'm just a little hazy and hesitant on that one adjustment.
So for that, a 6-unit development would no longer have to comply with any provisions for attached structures. So it wouldn't affect, it would make it maybe easier for the example that you had in mind. Because right now, the language is there to limit for any buildings with more than 10 units, with 10 or more units. So we're trying to be a little bit more flexible, reduce that threshold to 4 or fewer units. But then we are being clear about that clarification on the 50% limit is cumulatively applied to all detached accessory structures on the site.
Okay, with that, I think I'm comfortable with the proposed changes.
Okay. Commissioner Conley.
Yeah, I have a question with regard to open space. If we can go to that slide. With regard to multifamily, you have a currently 375 square foot of usable shared open required, and the change is recommended, I guess, from 350 to, from 375 to 350 because that simplifies calculation. What it does too is it also reduces your open space. I'm kind of in favor of more open space rather than less when you have people, multifamilies crammed in together. And it would be a lot more simpler to calculate 400 square feet than 350 if you want to simplify if this is the reason for doing it. 400 square feet would allow for more open space and would be even more simpler, 20 by 20 or 10 by 40, whatever. It's a lot easier to calculate 400 than 350. That's my point.
So today, if somebody provided, it's a little bit more than 200 square feet, but if they provided approximately 200 square feet as private open space, that would satisfy their 300, and they would need a little more than 200 to get to, but private open space counts 1.5 times. So if I give 200 square feet of private open space, that counts as 350 square feet of open space. What we're saying is get rid of that differentiation between private and shared. So I'm no longer necessitating, private patios, but we will always get at least 350 square feet of open space. That's the intent. And because right now we ask the architects to, they've got to, it's a challenge to calculate, okay, how much of this is private open space? Give me a number, and I've got to calculate that times 1.5, and then I've got to deduct that from the total number of open space square feet that I have to give, and that's all of it's got to add up to this 375, which is a weird number. So we did run several scenarios, and essentially, I think we may end up with more shared open space and less private open space, but more square footage overall.
Thank you, Katie.
That was the intent. The math may not, you may disagree with but that having to count private open space 1.5 times as much as shared open space makes the math pretty, not complicated, but just like, narrowing down on what's private and then anyway, it's less than fun.
Thank you, Katie. Commissioner Marlowe.
Yeah, I'm okay with most of these. I had the same question about reducing storage on multifamily, like who wants less space in their home? I'm not sure who said that. So I would not be in favor of reducing storage. But could you go to the next slide just so I can refresh my memory real quick? And then the rest of them, yeah, I have no issues with. I think that, one large playground's great. And I think the rest of them I'm fine with. I just not in favor of reducing any storage for people in multifamily homes. I know storage is always a challenging discussion and people like to have space to put stuff, so.
Thank you. Commissioner Davis?
Yeah, I'm not in favor.
I'm so sorry. I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't have my microphone on. Genevieve, I'm sorry. Could you go to the last slide, please?
Sure.
Just so I can go down the list.
This is the last slide. You want me to start with the first one?
Yeah, the first one. Yeah, go back to that one, please. Okay,
Right,
I am very much not in favor of reducing the storage requirements. I can't tell you how many times we have been concerned about the overflow on the balcony. And so I really want our multifamily to be desirable places to live and that they have enough room to put their stuff in a pretty compact environment. I am not really in favor of reducing open space. I kind of liked your 400 idea. I'd rather have more open space, whether it's shared or private. I really want our multifamily to be desirable places. We're working hard to get more multifamily units, but we want them to be the place to be. So I would be in favor of increasing open space. Next slide, the last slide, I guess.
I think we have 2.
Okay, and the tot, I think that's a fine idea. Having, segmented tot lots didn't quite make sense to me, so having a well-organized multi-purpose playground seems very, very logical to me. And gosh, the detached accessory structures are limited to 50% of the gross floor area for buildings with 10. I'm a little concerned with several stories and not enough room in between them. So I'm kind of on the fence on that last one. But those first few were the ones I felt strongly opposed to.
Okay. If there's no follow-up, I'll make my comments here real quick. I am in agreement. I do not like the idea of reducing the size of storage. I know that's just a common, I know developers are always trying to minimize that space, but I just have seen too many times where that just becomes a problem later. And I agree with my fellow commissioners that I want multifamily to be really someplace that people really want to go, and it's not just some apartment complex. Jumping down to the open space aspect of that, again, I agree with Commissioner Davis on that. I do not want to incentivize getting rid of private open space. I feel like that also adds to the quality of the living space that people get, and I think everybody likes having a little bit of that privacy. Although I understand some projects, if they're going to have a larger park and it maybe doesn't fit the exact amount of square footage for the space, but it's a large shared space, and I guess I'd be okay for some adjustment in that, but I really don't like the idea of incentivizing making outdoor or open space smaller. And I don't know how do we come to fix that, because I understand what you're saying. Your point about the private space counting as 1.5 times, I agree with you. That's I could see how that really complicates it. as Commissioner Covarrubias always says, you've been saying tonight, is there a way to simplify that? I don't know what that would be, but I truly do not want to I don't want to incentivize to get rid of private open space, and I don't want to, make open space available to be smaller. So I hope that answers some of your questions for Genevieve. Does anybody have any other comments on that? Moving on.
I just want to agree with you. That's was my concern too.
Okay. Yeah. And then I guess one last item. I think I'm okay with this simplifying the setbacks. I can see what the purpose is for it. I am a little concerned that it could get a little wonky, but I think I'm okay with that, and I'm okay with the other items too. So that's it for me. I think we're all in agreement. No other comments? Okay, so we're moving on. Thanks, Genevieve.
Great, thank you. I think commercial and industrial and the other zones will be easier, but we still have to get through hillsides as well. So commercial districts,
Genevieve,
a lot of these.
Genevieve,
Yes?
I'm sorry, one real quick question. Does anybody need to take a quick break? No? Good? Okay, we're good. Thanks. Sorry. Wanted to do.
Great, thank you. Commercial districts, a lot of these districts didn't really have a clear purpose, so we've added individual purpose statements for each of these districts. We've also paralleled some of that kind of transition zone pieces that we wrote into the objective design standards for multifamily. We've paralleled that into some of the transitions between commercial districts and when they're adjacent to an R1 zoning district. So right now there is a setback required, 5-foot side setback and a 10-foot rear setback if you're adjacent to a single family zone. We've also added to require a fence and a landscape buffer in addition to soften that transition zone. Those are proposed changes in all the commercial districts. The OP zoning district was pretty comprehensively overhauled. That was a really kind of wonky district. It had a lot of really specific nuances. We really wanted to simplify it. Again, hopefully we might make some changes later on to rezone parts of it. But we wanted to remove some of the things that are covered elsewhere in the code and really make it more consistent with other similar zoning districts. So making accessory structure height consistent with how the city's knows accessory structure height is 15 feet in all other zones, but here it was 20 feet. So we wanted to make it 15 feet like it is in all other zones. There were some kind of weird nuances in this zone too. There's no language about what density is. CUP is required for multifamily, but existing multifamily is considered non-conforming. There were some internal conflicts. We wanted to make it clear. A CUP is still required for any multifamily residential. There's a maximum density consistent with, kind of paralleling the T3F zoning district, so 12 units to the acre, and really making it clear what the development standards are in this zone. In the R1 or in the office professional district as well, there was a higher than average ratio for office, and we've made it consistent with office throughout the city to match, just so it is parking for office is the same throughout town. There's some existing language about adaptive reuse of an existing building would have to go through planning commission approval for a reduction in parking. We've removed that. Instead, we've talked about this a couple of times about having a process to go through a major modification to reduce parking, where you have to do a parking study and you have to make findings. So that adaptive reuse would fit under that umbrella of that major modification process. We added standards for multifamily, making it clear if you're building multifamily in the OP zone, you'd comply with R3 and the objective design standards. You still have to do a CUP. The detached accessory structures in this zone were limited to 50% of the primary structure and a 20-foot height. Here again, we want to be clear and consistent with our cumulative gross floor area of 50% and a height of 15 feet instead, to be consistent with detached accessory structures throughout the other zoning districts. The other non-residential zoning districts in CP and RC, There's currently an allowance for up to 50 feet for non-habitable buildings. This parallels some of the discussion that we had in the RA zoning districts. Again, removing that height limit for non-habitable buildings and instead looking at the existing height limit for buildings as they are regulated, and then allowing for projections beyond that through that projection section of Article 4, and any deviations from that would go through the site plan review or the development plan review process. The AP zone had no development standards, so we added some new standards, really used kind of what's been approved in the past, and still left it fairly open-ended here, but did add a minimum lot size, minimum lot width, and a height of 60 feet in that zone. I ran through it a little quickly, but that is all of the commercial district's proposed changes. Pause there.
Do we have any comments, commissioners? Commissioner Neal.
I'm just back to the side setback with a landscape buffer and fence. I'm not sure that you're going to get an effective landscape buffer in 5 feet with a fence, but I don't. And what is a landscape buffer as a definition? Is it defined?
Yes, we've added a landscape buffer with minimum kind of non-deciduous evergreen tree plantings with a minimum distancing requirement to be pretty clear about what that means.
So I guess you have a side yard, you have 3 foot of access, and then the fence, is that 18 inches of planting area that we can work with? I don't know. But the rest of them seem fine to me.
That's a good point.
Commissioner Marlowe? Do you have any comments? No? Commissioner Conley?
I'm good.
Commissioner Davis? Got it. Commissioner Koger, do you have any questions or comments at this time?
Yeah, nothing new, other than I've long had the concern about the width of landscape relative to fences.
Thank you. Commissioner Covarrubias?
Nothing new to add.
I have nothing new to add either. Commissioner Davis?
Yeah, I think I have a concern about the narrow width for the landscape buffer.
Great. Okay, I think we're, does that help you out, Genevieve?
It does, thank you.
Got it.
Okay, let's look at parks, public facilities, parks and open space, and agriculture zoning districts. Here again, we don't have too many huge changes. So in the agricultural zone, again, that same height limit with non-habitable buildings, removing that height limit for non-habitable, just looking at habitable, and then the projections beyond that. The ag zoning district was extremely long and with lots and lots of standards. We tried to cull those that really didn't make sense. There were some odd ones in there, and so we removed all of those. There's a real estate disclosure sample form that was codified. We take that out. Those are handouts, and we moved some of the animal husbandry regulations to Article 6 to try and shorten this this zoning district while still maintaining the intent of the zone. The parks and open space zoning district, that just punts to the R1 zoning district for development standards, some of which really don't make sense, including that setback, which varies based on lot size width. So we tried to simplify, we tried to mirror the R1 development standards, but in a slightly simplified way, and articulate that within that zoning district. And then this zone was also silent on when they're adjacent to residential zoning districts. And here again, we are trying to parallel those transition zones. So anything that is against residential districts would have to do those setbacks if they are adjacent to a residential zoning district. And that is all on open space and agriculture before we jump into overlays.
Thank you. Commissioner Neal?
I guess my question is, what would be a setback on an open space?
So any building that is placed within the open space. So if you have a park structure, or if it's a restroom building in the agricultural zoning district, of course, that could be a barn or anything else. And there are specific requirements for additional setbacks for some particular uses within the ag zone that could be more noxious.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Any other commissioners? Okay, I think I think I'm fine with it. So if we're ready to move on. Thanks, Genevieve.
Great, thank you. Looking at overlay districts, most of the proposed revisions here are looking at the mixed use overlay, and there's not a lot of changes here really at all to the intent, but really just mostly clarifying here. The mixed use overlay wasn't super clear that you could do a standalone residential use in the mixed use overlay. So we wanted to make that really clear that you can do standalone residential in a mixed use overlay, that the intent of the overlay is really to allow residential, be it vertical mixed use, horizontal mixed use, or a standalone residential use. The overlay didn't have standards on minimum dimensions for open space. So we added those, that minimum dimensions that are consistent with other zoning districts. There was kind of an odd table in the mixed use overlay that had a section that implied that you could do mixed use in residential zones. So you could add commercial in. I don't think that was the intent, but that is the way that I was reading it. So we cleaned that up to say you can do mixed use, including standalone residential, in the commercial zones, and this is how it will be regulated. Here again, that private open space was counted as 1.5 times the value of shared open space. Whatever we determine, I think in the other sections, we'd like to parallel that here. So we will revisit that based on feedback that we've heard from the commission tonight, and parallel that within the mixed use overlay, unless you have alternative direction on that. And then just some very minor name changes to overlays. And then the hillside overlay, we'll go into this one a lot more detail actually. The proposal is to remove that as an overlay and regulate instead based on the slope of a property. Right now, there's a map in the zoning code where the hillside overlay basically applies to nearly the entire city. But really the intent is to regulate those slopey lots. So anything that has an average slope of more than 10% would be subject to hillside development standards rather than having to map it and put it in an overlay. So that is the summary of changes to the overlays.
Okay. Any comments, questions from commissioners? Nope, seeing none. I do have one comment. Again, I am not in favor of recommending incentivizing getting rid of private open space. I think that's an important part of the quality of multifamily, in my opinion. So, and I don't know that I necessarily agree with allowing them to take private and make it a combination so that it's public. And so you got my points from that earlier. Thank you.
I want to change my school of thought on that. I'm going to agree with
Commissioner Marlowe. Go ahead.
I agree. I now that I think about it more, actually, if anything, maybe we add a requirement to add private, space, but maybe you can't do that. So I changed my school of thought on that. I think we should somehow incentivize giving people some space to call their own.
Great, thank you. Any other comments from other commissioners? Nope, seeing none, I think we can move on, Genevieve.
Great. Looking at Article 8. So these are our environmental standards. They include floodplain management, hillside development, lighting, noise, oak tree presence.
I apologize. I'm sorry. Mr. Kogler.
Sorry to interrupt,
Genevieve.
Genevieve, but would it behoove us, I don't know that we've really taken public comment on Article 3. We've taken pieces. Is it appropriate to open up public comment on Article 3 before we move on to Article 8?
I suppose we could do that.
We've been focused on that, and I suspect
8 will garner less discussion than 3, but I could be wrong.
That is a good point. So let's open public comment for, yeah, thank you. Article 2, right?
3.
Article 3, sorry. All these numbers, man, I know, it's... Right, so, all right, we're going to have open public comment for Article 3. Do we have any comments on Article 3, anything we haven't discussed? You'll have an opportunity later for public comment as well. Anybody on the line, Marcy?
No callers.
Okay, thank you. Good call, Commissioner Kogler. Moving on, Genevieve, go right ahead.
Great, thank you. So with regard to these Article 8 chapters, oak tree preservation really just references to another section of the municipal code. We wanted to include it here in our environmental standards so that, you know, if folks look to here, they know to find it somewhere else. So we do a lot of cross-referencing in this reorganized code to help people find what they're looking for. There's also really no substantive changes to the section called performance standards. These are, you know, noise, vibration, and, you know, kind of there's a list of performance standards that exist within the code today, and we really didn't make any changes there. So I wasn't planning on going over those in much detail. I'll go over these other chapters tonight, though. The floodplain management chapter of the zoning ordinance, the existing ordinance was reviewed by the city's engineering department, and they proposed some quite minor changes, really just to make the functioning of this ordinance work better for them, react to some of the definitions that they find need to be updated and clarified, some processes that need to be clarified. There's some requirements for how applicants submit information to FEMA, and that is incorporated into these, noting that folks still have to get other permits, not just the FEMA required for permits, and making clarification that the floodplain administrator is the city engineer and not the community development director. This is a section of the code that's really largely entirely used by the city's engineering department. So we really wanted to fold them into the discussion here, and they made their input, and those changes are really the only changes that are included in this section. The hillside standards are another section where we really tried to make the process significantly more clear, simplified conflicting sections, and really reduced the volume of regulations, some of which were kind of contradictory to each other. The first proposed change is, like I mentioned, to remove that hillside overlay and instead regulate based on the average slope of a lot. So any lot with an average slope of more than 10% has to comply with the hillside standards. In the current code, the hillside standards are actually embedded underneath single-family zoning districts. So it's difficult to find or use for multifamily districts, and it's not at all mentioned if you happen to have a slopey lot and you're located out in a commercial zone or any of the other zones. So these revisions would instead apply hillside standards across the board based on slope, which is a lot kind of fairer application of the ordinance. Some of the additional clarifications really reduced the language and the volume of this section, especially since there were regulations that applied separately for new lots and existing lots. We folded everything together to try and make it cleaner and clearer. Much of the existing hillside standards were also linked to the PD overlay in kind of a strange way. So in this draft, we extracted those two things as separate and independent things, which is how they're actually used today. A PD overlay might be applied to property without a slope, and hillside standards don't have to have a PD overlay. So this was the part of the code where lot side and slope were linked, and now that's extracted out. So all single-family zoning districts, it's clear what their minimum lot sizes are based on the slope in that zoning district. Landscape standards and hillsides are also proposed to be enhanced, including this one new requirement we wanted to highlight, a new requirement for planting trees for graded area, for every 1,000 square feet of graded area to plant one tree. Currently, the landscape requirements require any street trees that would be required, and then erosion control landscaping. Those are the only current requirements that exist today. The grading and retaining wall standards. There's a great table in the code that lists how tall retaining walls can be and how much grading can happen. And we wanted to make that really clear so that these apply to anything with a slope greater than 10%. They're not just applying to single family. We didn't make any changes to the height of a retaining wall or the distance between retaining walls for single family zoning districts. But we did want to clarify that these standards also apply to multifamily. That was embedded as kind of a cross-reference. So now that's clear in the table. And we wanted to add regulations for retaining walls and grading heights in non-residential zoning districts. So that's also added to the table and allowed pretty consistent with those zoning districts. The existing code also talks about exterior retaining walls, but doesn't talk at all about interior retaining walls. It also doesn't define what it means by exterior retaining walls. So we defined those and provided some graphic examples of what the intent of an interior retaining wall or an exterior retaining wall is. And the exterior retaining wall is one that is facing a property line so that you can really see it from either a neighboring property or the right-of-way, whereas an interior property line, it's really just facing your structure, so you can't see it from the property line or from a neighboring structure. So here we're allowing for a higher retaining wall if you can't see it from the street or from your neighbor. So we're being a little bit more flexible. We wanted, when we actually went to define these exterior versus interior and then realized we didn't have standards for interior, we added that a little bit more allowance for a higher retaining wall if it's not visible from a neighboring property or from the public right of way. So we wanted to ask the commission, because that is like a very new standard there, with this new interior versus exterior retaining wall idea, would you like to see that regulated the same as the external walls, or would you like to see that allow for an 8-foot height limit, or the 10-foot height limit is what we wrote into that, into the current draft for your review and discussion? And I'll pause there because we have a question on the slide.
You want some feedback from commission? Is that what you're saying, Genevieve?
I would love some feedback.
Okay. Commissioner Conley?
Yeah, with regard to exterior, interior retaining walls, I would assume that any retaining wall over a certain height would have to be brought to the engineering department and maybe have to be designed by a civil engineer. But in any event, I would be concerned for higher limits on the retaining walls because of the concern that kids play on them. There would seem to need to be some type of barrier or some type of cable system to keep someone from falling from a greater height. So my concern would be that regardless of whether it's interior or exterior, you don't want someone to fall from a greater height. And I don't know what the requirements the city has on how it's designed and whether it has to have safety rails, but I would tend to want the same height restrictions because retaining walls don't really look good whether they're interior or exterior. But that's my 2 cents, and kind of a question as to what design standards are in place right now.
So most of the safety standards for retaining walls are actually in the California Building Code. And so depending on, sort of what's above the retaining wall, there are standards that are required. So we didn't put anything, most of the retaining wall standards that are in the zoning ordinance are related to appearance. The safety standards, structural requirements, those are in the California Building Code. So you're right. Once a retaining wall gets over a certain threshold, and I want to say it's 4 feet from the footing to the top, but don't quote me on that number, the building department does require a building permit with structural calculations for that retaining wall. The the standards that we're looking at tonight are really related to aesthetics. If you wanted to put something more about safety railing, we could certainly add it, but the building code already has, standards that would be applicable.
Okay, I thought maybe that would be the case, but I don't see any need to increase it for interior, in my opinion.
Commissioner Marlowe?
Well, so we put a 10-foot limit on a retaining wall, but they need larger than that. Couldn't they just tier retaining walls and essentially just have a 20-foot wall anyway if they wanted to? So if they could do that in one wall versus two, I'm not really, if you got to put a 12-foot wall, you got to put a 12-foot wall, right? I'm not really sure why limiting the height would be. I get they're not super pretty, but if it's required so someone can make appropriate use of the property, I think that allowing it be a case-by-case basis maybe, but I don't see how. I'm not really in favor of either limit, but I guess, I would defer to the rest of the commissioners.
Yeah, so in the code today for retaining walls in your rear yard, they can be a maximum of 6 feet in height. So that's existing.
Okay.
We are adding to the code greater allowance for modifications. I believe if you wanted to exceed the height limit by 2 feet, you can go to the DRC and ask for that change. If you wanted to go higher than that, you could come to the Planning Commission and get it would be a major modification. So currently there are standards. We're providing a process for modification, and then our thought was to allow retaining walls that really only affect the subject property. So like if I want to put a huge retaining wall in my backyard and no one else can see it, do we care? And that's why we put that 10 feet, but maybe we do. So anyway, the point is, you're right, you could tier when there are standards within both the existing and proposed code for tiering, having certain separations between the retaining walls. But the idea is to soften the appearance of, just stark, really tall retaining walls.
Sure. Okay.
Commissioner Neal?
Oh, I just think a 10-foot wall could be oppressive, especially against a residence. And the person building it may not be there for their entire life of the house. But I think I'd like to regulate the retaining wall internal the same as external.
Commissioner Kogler, you agree? Commissioner Covarrubias?
I agree, but Katie, I have a question. Give me an example of an interior retaining wall.
The numbering on the exhibits that I downloaded from the city's website don't seem to correspond to the page numbering, but within Article 3, there is a drawing, and I don't know if we could get it on the screen. Looks like you had it.
And maybe I can help while you're looking, but if you had a retaining wall in your backyard to create some flat area for your backyard, and it was up against somebody else's backyard, that would be more of an interior. As opposed to if you lived on a corner and you had a retaining wall that was adjacent to the sidewalk along a street, that's what they're referring to as an
exterior versus.
And then Katie, a quick question, is this specific to residential or is this commercial?
So currently it's just to residential, but we are proposing it be applied also to commercial. So that is a change.
Comments might be more specific to commercial projects where, the Lowe's Center has some pretty tall separate walls that we kind of all forget about, but they're internal, but the building covers quite a bit of it. The other buildings in the front along Highway 46 cover that too. But that's a situation where you've got some pretty tall retaining walls trying to make a project work. It didn't limit, I don't think they were limited to a 6-foot or a 10-foot.
Right. And in that case for Lowe's, they would have come to the Planning Commission for a development plan, and they could have asked for that modification at the same time. So, the idea is to set a kind of a guideline and then also allow for flexibility. But it is a change.
So this would be someone comes in, commercial, residential, there's a certain height limit. Over that, they come forward. If it was a project that did need to come to the Planning Commission anyway,
they could make the request, correct?
Thank you
for that. And the images that we see here at the top, these are the proposed images. So the top would be an exterior retaining wall where the property line is on the right. The retaining wall face is facing basically the public. Somebody else has to look at that retaining wall, whereas the interior retaining wall at the bottom, I'm putting in this retaining wall for my own property, and, I'm the one who has to live with the canyon that I've created. That's the idea, is that those interior retaining walls really aren't necessarily a public interest, although, as we've heard, there's a fall hazard, so maybe they're inappropriate, but that was staff's intent.
So, any other commissioners have comment?
No, I'm in favor of the 8-foot internal and external.
Okay, and this is Christensen. I would be okay with a set size. The 10 feet would be fine with me for both. I do think that having both, they can always come back through the development plan process if they need to make a variance to that.
So for clarity, the current proposal is to leave those exterior retaining walls in the rear yard. The maximum height is 6 feet. In side and front yards, the maximum is 4 feet. And the change that we're proposing, and we can certainly make other changes if that's your guidance, is that it's just those interior retaining walls that we would allow to be taller is the proposed change. So I just want to make that clear.
Thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate it. In that regard, then, I'm okay with the current standard for the interior, because they have a process. They can come before us and look at something larger. And any other comments? Did we help clarify that, Genevieve? Or maybe we complicated it for you?
I think so.
I'm hearing we want to treat retaining walls all the same, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
I think that was a consensus. I hope I didn't confuse you.
That was my intent, yeah.
Yep, okay, yep, thank you.
Okay, great. Moving on to the next slide. So this is kind of a clarification on the structure of the hillside standards. This is in the current code. Individual pad grading is allowed on any lot that has an average slope of less than 15%. And then if you have an average slope of more than 15%, you have to go to the DRC and have a discussion about that pad loading, the pad grading. Here we've created some clear thresholds to kind of provide a little bit more guidance around that, because we often really don't want the pad grading to happen on very steep slopes. We'd like that the very steep slopes to develop with more stem walls, kind of stepping the structure up in line with the hillside. So we've created these thresholds for that system to happen. So if consistent with current regulations, 15% slope, less than 15% of slope, you can still do your pad grading. Where that nuance comes in is over 15%. 15% to 35%, we would like to require that stem walls are used or no pad grading is used. And then clarify that areas that are more than 35% slope, you're not going to disturb those areas. You're not going to be building your structures. You're not going to be grading it for pathways and mini soccer fields. That would be kind of the area of your lot that you wouldn't be developing. But that said, we want us to have a clear process for modifications. And so that's what's outlined here in this table. So if you do want to make some modifications to these hillside standards, we want to make it really clear, who do you talk to for those requests? Do you go to the DRC? Does it go up to the planning commission level? Or does it really need to go to the city council level at a special plan development permit level? So some of these, like looking at the height of graded slopes or the going up a couple extra feet on a retaining wall, those can be addressed at either site plan review or development plan modification level. The distance between walls too, looking at talking to planning commission for that. If you'd like to do an individual pad on a slope that's between 15% and 35%, rather than today it would go to DRC, we're proposing that it would go to planning commission. That is that can be a lot of grading associated with that. And so there's the noticing and additional kind of review that can come through a planning commission review through that process. If you were to look at building over 35% slope, that would go to a special plan development permit process to talk to city council about that. And then landscape standards, we can look at, based on whatever type of development permits you have. If you have a site plan, you would go through a site plan modification if you wanted to modify those landscape standards. And that concludes the hillside standards substantive changes that we would like to discuss with you tonight. So I'd like to pause there and get your feedback and thoughts on this piece.
Thank you, Genevieve. I'll start with Commissioner Neal.
I'm fine with the proposed changes.
Commissioner Kogler.
I'm fine as well.
Commissioner Covarrubias.
That makes 3 in a row.
Commissioner Davis.
4.
Commissioner Conley.
Yeah, I think they're good. I'm in favor of it.
Commissioner Marlowe, do you have any comments or your thoughts?
Just to clarifying, the slope is average lot slope, correct? So
correct.
Would there be any provisions if, they had a flat spot and then the rest of the lot was super slope? I guess they would just bring that to DRC. So I'm in favor of it. Just wanted to clarify.
And this is Chairperson Christensen, and that was a good point, by the way, but there's a process for it, so I'm in agreement with it. It's fine. Thank you.
Great. Moving on then to lighting and illumination. And we heard public comment earlier on in our workshop series about lighting and illumination and about a desire for dark sky protections. And so that is incorporated into this section. Right now, there's really no unique section on lighting in the code. Some zoning districts mention it briefly. So here we have a new section that has a purpose statement discussing dark sky compliance or equivalent. And really, one of the key features is to require shielding. So each light fixture has to be shielded with a minimum of 2-inch shielding from the light source. And we've got a graphic that shows that. And that's really directing the light down and minimizing uplighting that would conflict with dark sky compliance. We do have some height fixture limitations, and we would allow for a modification to those height fixtures through the development plan major modification process. This section also includes a new standard for illumination in parking lots. So any parking lots that have more than 6 or more spaces, would have to illuminate equivalent to 0.5-foot candles. So to have throughout the parking lot area a level of illumination that can actually be measured. And that, I can pause on lighting if there's any comments on this one.
I think Commissioner Davis.
I really do like this addition, Genevieve. One thing I just, here we have oak trees and in landscaping, and there might be some uplighting to feature that. So is that going to prohibit that in any way? I mean, I really like the idea in parking lots, and I'm just wondering, oak tree is kind of what we're known for. Can they have any uplighting for that purpose? Just something I might want to ask, and if that would be then disallowed with this new change?
I think the intent would be yes, any uplighting, because it would need to be shielded. So if that is a caveat carve out that we'd like to list in here, we could do that.
I just want to bring it up, something that I thought about.
Commissioner Marlowe.
Where did we come up with the 1/2-foot candles for 6 spaces? Because I just went through this exercise on an RV park, and the requirement they did was from some other parking, which was 0.2 of a foot candle. And I just want to, 6 spaces isn't that many. I don't know that, you need 1/2 foot candle, 0.5-foot candle. So am I curious to where that came from, because I think it might be overkill, and we're trying to eliminate too much lighting to avoid, making the place look like a big bright city. So just want to look at that and see where that requirement comes from, and maybe there's a way you can adjust that requirement, because we were doing it for an RV park. They followed some parking thing, and it was going to be like a giant stadium by the time you were done. In order to get 0.2-foot candles everywhere, I think 0.5 might be extreme, but I haven't gone out with my light meter and verified what half a foot candle is, but I just know it's not a requirement for everything. So just, I think that you could probably either make it more spaces or reduce it or do a range, just some suggestions.
Thank you. Commissioner Conley?
Thank you. With regard to light pollution, I think this is all good, and I like the proposed changes. I guess I would be kind of like Commissioner Marlowe as to what standards do you have, or where are you getting the standards from? And with regard to lighting oak trees, I guess, in my opinion, we look at oak trees probably more during the day than at night, but lighting an oak tree might be okay if you had a backdrop to it, but you're causing more light pollution if you have enough light, and I'm in favor of the proposed changes overall.
Commissioner Neal?
I just wonder if some of the carve-outs we have here are compliant with the dark sky. Does the dark sky say half a foot candle for parking lots, or does the dark sky say the design and shielding should be a minimum 2-inch shield? And then additionally, they do have stepped light fixtures for parking lots. So when the parking lot is not busy, it's a little darker. And then when folks with motion detectors go by, the lights kick up. So that might be also something we want to include. Getting in the minutia now.
Commissioner Coker? Commissioner Covarrubias?
I think Commissioner Neal hit on something I was thinking about. How does motion sensor lights affect this, if at all? Genevieve?
Yeah, right now, I don't believe I'm getting my Atascadero and Paso confused because I'm also working on theirs, but we did add motion detectors into one of ours. So I think that's a good clarification that we can, if the Planning Commission would like it, we can require motion detectors in parking lots to turn them off when they're not in use.
And it isn't off, it's just down.
Dimmed.
It's just dimmed.
Right.
It's significantly dimmed, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There also might be a Title 24 requirement that talks about that already, because they're always trying to reduce power consumption. So there might be already a California Title 24 compliance requirement for doing that parking lot. So we might want to just include that.
And then also how do I say this? I know we talked about uplighting on oak trees. Guilty. I have a huge oak tree in my backyard, and I have uplighting on it. It looks beautiful, and it's masked by the oak tree a little bit.
Gonna have to take it out.
I know. But I also have landscaping lighting. How does landscaping lighting affect this, Genevieve? Because I have fence lighting along my fence line, around my other line. Yeah.
We don't currently have an exemption for landscape lighting built in. So if that's something you want to see, currently there is not an exemption proposed.
Okay.
I guess, most of that landscaping lighting is low voltage, which is not subject to permitting. So I think really this is all subject to permitting, which is going to be 120 volt lighting. So probably the stuff you're buying that's 12 volt isn't going to be subject to the permit, and
solar powered
will just be exempt.
Yeah. Okay. Just curious.
Did you have a thought? Commissioner Davis?
No, I think I brought it up. I would see more of a commercial operation wanting to do some uplighting their landscaping than residential. And, they're still in that dark sky compliant. If you can see it in your commercial area, it still might be somewhat of an issue. So I'm just here to represent the oak trees.
This is Chairperson Christensen. I would agree on the foot candles. I think there should be some allowance for some variance in that. Obviously, per project, I think it would be something that I understand you want the safety, but you also should allow for a little bit, for less really. And Commissioner Neal's questions on the dark sky compliancy might help clarify some of that that we can work around. Other than that, I'm happy that we have this, and I think it's wonderful that we've added it. And if we have the ability to go through development plan modification for uplighting on an oak tree. I can see that very well could fit right in with that if somebody wanted to request some kind of special modification. Okay.
I know that we do have a member of the public who is here for this specific item, so whether or not you want to hear his comments now is just so you know.
Thank you. That's great. Okay, so we'll take a pause here and we'll take it to public comments. Do we have someone here that would like to talk about this in public comments?
Hi there, Katie, thank you for that. Hi, Tony Gaspar again, Country View Lane. Chairperson and commissioners, thank you so much for all of the work you're doing. This is an incredible amount of work, and I appreciate, as a citizen of the city, I truly appreciate you. With regard to the lighting, I'm very, very happy. Well, first of all, I'm here as president of the Paso Robles Dark Sky organization. And our whole objective is to help educate and advocate for the eradication of light pollution. And that's what we're all about. This ordinance draft is a great, great start. I'm really delighted to see it. What I would ask is that the commission direct staff to work with us, which, by the way, staff has already offered to work with us to kind of add some more language. But in general, there are just a few things that are missing out of this ordinance that I would really encourage you to suggest in the draft. Number one is the language should say no uplighting, because uplighting is killing the dark skies, right? So no uplighting. There should be an inclusion about, and by the way, I do have all these notes that I will share with staff. There should be an inclusion that new building permits above a certain amount the property should then be subjected to modernizing their lighting into compliance. There should be the guide to right here, which is what are actually dark sky compliant fixtures and what are not compliant. Since they're referenced in the ordinance as dark sky compliant fixtures are necessary, there should be a guide to show what they actually are. So that's just a little housekeeping there. And then just a couple more, because I know it's been a long night. New residential street lighting, it should be specific in there that new residential street lighting should comply with dark sky. Street lighting is the #1 cause of light pollution in this country. So new streets lighting should comply. And there should be a signage section stating that new signs should comply and billboards should comply, because billboards very often use uplighting and they do have downlighting for billboards. And lastly, this is a big one. I would ask the commission to guide the city to make a statement that the city wants to lead by example. There's language in the current draft that says the city buildings would be exempt from the dark sky, from this lighting ordinance. My recommendation is that, or my ask is that the commission direct staff to include in the language that new city buildings would be compliant. Seems logical. And if the city updates their current building lighting, that the new lighting be compliant. So the city lead by example. And I truly thank you for your time. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Do we have any other public comments?
Hello, my name is John Samsky. I am helping Tony. I am the treasurer of the Paso Robles Dark Sky. I just would like to thank you all. This is my first time being at any government, anything, and I just cannot believe the hard work that you guys all go through. And I know this is not one night and you're done. So I appreciate that. I also appreciate you letting us give public comment. I just wanted to add to Tony what he was saying and just express my desire for this. I grew up in a big city and we do not have stars. When I moved here, it was very special to look up and see stars. And I know the stars keep our small town what it is. And that's all I have.
Great. Thank you. Any other public comments? Anybody online, Marcy?
No callers.
No callers? Okay, closing public comment on this item and moving back to the commission. Any comments at this time go ahead?
Thank you, Chair.
Yes.
Just a quick comment. So with all this dark light ordinance, what about existing structures, commercial? I mean, is there going to be is there a plan in place for improvement of, I mean, if you've got a significant upward facing light on a commercial building, is there a plan to address that? I'm just curious.
So the current proposal would just be for any new light, is how we've written it. Mr. Gaspar's recommendation would be that there be some sort of threshold, maybe, it's 10,000 or it's 100,000. If you're applying for a building permit that is worth some certain valuation, we would then make you retrofit all of your lights. As I said, the current proposal is just for anything new, but we're all, ears open.
But it sounds like if the opportunity presents itself to go back, because they're asking for something on an existing building, that we can ask that modifications be made.
We could certainly put it in, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, thank you.
Commissioner Marlowe?
Are new government buildings exempt from this requirement? I mean, I trust, but I want to verify.
So currently the ordinance is proposed to exempt lighting for U.S. flags, temporary construction lighting that's necessary for an allowed use would be exempt. Temporary holiday lighting would be exempt. And then it also does say city-owned facilities. I think when we drafted that, we were thinking about sports fields primarily because they obviously have very bright lights. We could refine the language or, we're looking for guidance.
Yeah, I would absolutely. If we're going to make people building buildings do it, we should make our own government make sure we follow the same rules we imply. And as far as street lighting is concerned, I mean, that's really kind of outside of our purview because this would be anything for a permit. So I think that's who would determine the street lighting requirements on that? Like what entity would do that? City council?
So the city engineer plays a role, but yes, the city council ultimately approves the specs that we use for public improvements.
Yeah, and that was more of a clarification. We don't really have a ability to do that, but I think we should absolutely, any new building should, government or otherwise, should follow the same rules, and any renovation after a certain dollar amount should also follow those rules. That would be my vote.
Commissioner Connolly.
Thank you, Chair. I tend to agree with Commissioner Marlowe. If there's an exception process for a soccer field or an arena, then we go through the exception process. The city should have the same standard. But I think we could simplify this. This whole proposed change may have to go back and look at what the standards are for dark sky compliance and be modified to basically, it could be simplified by saying that it's compliant to the dark sky standards, and then have those standards a part of your standards. So this could actually be simplified if you have the standards as a part of this, just to say that it's compliant to dark sky standards, whatever the group or the national standards are for that.
Any other commissioners? Commissioner Davis has a question.
Tony, I'm really glad you're bringing this forward because as a commissioner for the last 7, 8 years or a long time, there have been quite a few times when people were asked about a development that was approved and what kind of lighting there seems to be a glare. So I know what you're trying to accomplish. And the question that I have, Katie, regarding city buildings, and I think we should set a standard, but we have Main Street and those street lights, and it's an established aesthetic. Is that downlighting, or would that have to be changed? I'm sorry I bring something up, but
Yeah, I think you're talking about the acorn globes, and a lot of those actually have, although they kind of glow on the top, they actually have, refractors in them that force most of the light down. So I think we install the current models, those could be found to be compliant with the dark sky standards as well.
And I know that there's discussion about safety at night downtown. So I personally want, I know what you're trying to get to, Tony, but I personally would like to see our city street lights for a safety purpose with that kind of, whatever you call the historical looking lighting. I would like to see that preserved.
Any other commissioners? Any other commissioner comments? Seeing none. I'm sure I think there's a lot of great things about the dark sky compliance proposal that is being met. I'm not sure that we can meet them all, but I'm in favor that we've even proposed this change and started really looking at the concept. I love seeing the stars too, and I live in town. But I also agree, safety's got to be a concern in some areas. We're not going to be able to meet every qualification of it, but I think looking to it as some guidelines is really a good idea, and it's a good place to start. So that's my opinion on that. And if we're okay with that, we'll move on, Genevieve.
Great, thank you. And we are nearing the end. I'd like to talk about noise. There's really not a lot of changes to the noise section here. Really wanted to parallel what is in the general plan for noise and add a purpose statement. There's some existing language in the ordinance that has either kind of run past its time. There was a provision to grandfather for 12 months. That's long since passed, so we could remove that. There's another provision that I think has been in there forever to revisit the noise ordinance every 3 years that is largely unnecessary and really not done, so we should remove that as well. And then there is an existing exemption process, but it doesn't really outline what it is. It just says you can go through an exemption process here. We make it clear we'd like, if you want to go outside of the noise ordinance, if you have a use that needs that doesn't comply with the noise ordinance, you would go through the development plan modification process. Go to Planning Commission and make your request through that process, and Planning Commission can make a determination based on the findings that are listed there. We cut out a few sections that are covered elsewhere and really tried to simplify this just slightly, but there's really not a lot of changes to the noise section so far. And similarly, with regard to surface mining and reclamation, there are some minor revisions to kind of clean it up and reflect the most recent Surface Mining and Reclamation Act part of the California Public Resources Code sections. So really just paralleling language in the state law and making sure that the city's consistent with that whenever anything comes up for surface mining and reclamation. I'll pause there, and then we have zoning map amendments, and then we can wrap.
Any comments, questions? I think we're good, Genevieve.
Okay. On zoning map amendments, these are really intended to be cleanup items that we either identified through the process or as we kind of went through and eliminated zones. So I will go through this quickly. One of the general map cleanup items is with regard to one lot out on the west side. This lot was annexed back in 2001, and it carried forward its county zoning of RS, which doesn't actually exist in the Paso Robles zoning code. So the proposal here is to match it as closely as possible to the existing zoning code, which would be R1B5, which is also the zoning of surrounding properties as well. Again, this is really just a map cleanup that's recommended, and to parallel so that this property can actually have some development standards associated with it. The second change here, there are two properties that are zoned R3O. We do propose to remove the entire R3O zoning district because it didn't make much sense. It only applied to two zones. We assume that R3O meant that it would, 5 parcels, but really just those two here, I think, 2 areas that are broken up into 5 parcels. The R3O zone, we would assume O meant office, but in the use table, it didn't allow office. There were no development standards or defined purpose. It was a really difficult zone to know what to do, what you could actually do under that zone. So the proposal is to eliminate that zone and instead apply the zoning that most appropriately matches what's already developed on these parcels, which is R3, which is also adjacent to the parcel. The parcels that are highlighted in red there's actually 4 parcels that are developed with multifamily uses. And office professional is the lot circled in blue, and that most closely parallels what's allowed on the ground. So this would allow for no uses on the ground would become non-conforming, and really just makes it a cleaner process for everyone involved, since that zone didn't really have development standards. Oops. All right, I just lost my screen. The third is to remove the hillside district overlay, which we had already discussed and found that everyone is in agreement with. And then finally, there are a number of special plan development overlays that exist around town that were really put in place prior to developing those properties and kind of intended to be preemptive conditions on the site. Now that they are developed, those conditions are a little bit moot. And so really just to clean up the code, these are a little bit tricky too to find. Sometimes they might exist and staff might not know that you have to implement them because they're kind of hidden somewhere in the code. So where they are already developed and really kind of moot, we're proposing to remove them. There are 3 overlays that are proposed, and staff's also looking at a couple other overlays that are special plan development overlays already developed. These things are really kind of out of date, and so we're proposing to remove them and from the map as well as the code. There's one on Theater Drive that required a CUP for anything that happens there, and then there's one on Creston and Sherwood, and one on Creston and Rolling Hills, also requiring a CUP and a finding that there'll be no effect on economic vitality of downtown. So these are already developed and proposed to be removed. And that concludes the discussion on zoning map amendment.
All right. I think we have, Commissioner Davis has a question really quick.
Genevieve, one for Genevieve, one for Katie. Genevieve, would there be any consequence to the property owners of the parcels being rezoned?
So with regard to the special plan of development, no, these are already developed and nothing is really changing. The CUPs are already in place. With regard to the R3O, again, no, these are already developed, and the use that is there today is what would be allowed moving forward. And the general map cleanup, no, this one is really just kind of an error that needs to be corrected.
Okay, well, that's kind of the answer I wanted to hear. And Katie, how would that be communicated to those parcel owners?
That's actually on Darcy and my immediate work plan. We do need to reach out to these property owners because this is, whether or not it's a substantial change, it's going to feel like a substantial change to these folks. So no changes will be, forced upon them. We will definitely be bringing them into the process. It just hasn't occurred up to this point, which is unfortunate.
I think one thing on these, because there's a lack of standards for these zones, it actually negatively impacts those properties right now. If a realtor called and said, what can I do? It's like, well, we don't know. It doesn't have a zoning district that exists. So I think this, if explained correctly, is really to the benefit of the property owners.
Good point. Thank you. Any other comments or, questions for staff from commissioners? No? Genevieve, is that the end of your presentation, or do we have more?
It sure is. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I know there's a lot to take in. So again, do we have any questions from commissioners for staff? If not, we're going to move to just making sure public comment. So at this point in time, we're going to open up for public comment. If we have anybody in the public that'd like to comment on any of the items that were discussed in this presentation, please feel free.
I'd just like to bring up the safety. I know.
I'm sorry, who are you, sir?
Oh, John Samsky.
Thank you.
I'd like to bring up the safety aspect. That was one of my first concerns, as well as regarding the dark sky. Dark skies do not necessarily mean dark streets. It's just about using the light properly. So I think with the right codes and ordinances, we can have safety and preserve the night sky and reduce light pollution. So safety, it's not like a tit for tat. So with the ordinances, we can get both.
Great, thank you. Welcome. Any other public comment? Marcy, do we have anybody on the line?
No callers.
Okay, we're going to close public comment. Moving back to the commission, do we have any discussion on the commission? Any commissioners have anything they want to discuss? Any final recommendations to staff? Nope, I don't think we need a vote for this, Warren, if I'm correct. So,
Yeah, this at this point it's just a workshop, so this is what we were looking for, so thank you.
perfect. Okay, so if we're good with that, no questions for Genevieve. She can probably get rid of us, so to speak. Thanks for all your work on that. I appreciate it. And Katie, too. That's a lot to take in and a lot to work on, I'm sure. Moving on, we're going to move to the consent calendar at this point in time. Do I have any comments or discussion on the consent calendar? I have a motion, Commissioner Kogler, to approve. Do I have a second? Second. I have Commissioner Marlowe, second. Can we get roll call, please?
Commissioner Kogler?
Aye.
Commissioner Marlowe?
Aye.
Commissioner Connolly?
Aye.
Commissioner Davis?
Aye.
Commissioner Covarrubias?
Aye.
Commissioner Neal?
Aye.
Chairperson Christensen?
Aye.
Motion passes 7-0.
All right, moving on to other reports. Do we have anything on Paso Robles Streetscape Ad Hoc Committee report?
Yeah, we did report back to the council. They gave us direction to schedule that neighborhood workshop, so we're looking at some time before summer to do that, so probably end of May, early June for that workshop is our target right now.
Thank you. Housing Constraints and Opportunities Committee, zoning code update report.
Yeah, so the Planning Commission just spent 3 hours reviewing the zoning ordinance.
Glad we could clarify it for the record. Anything on housing constraints? Nothing new?
No.
Okay, thank you. And then DRC rotation schedule. Do we have Commissioner Kogler?
Mr. Chair, excuse me, I have a problem that's come up for the 1st, and I'm not kidding about that, the 1st of April.
You're pulling a prank on us. Come on.
So if anybody can cover that, I'd be glad to cover whenever I can for anybody else.
I think that was canceled.
then I'm okay.
Am I correct, Marcy?
I'm sorry, say that again?
April 1st, DRC?
Yes, and that is not a joke.
Okay, good. Then, all right.
I withdraw my request.
No jokes. Everybody else good with the DRC schedule at this point in time?
Especially the first.
Obviously, you can hit us up as we move along. So, I'm sorry. Yes.
I might have a conflict on, sorry. This is Commissioner Covarrubias. I might have a conflict on May 13th. My daughter's getting married that weekend. So, I'm not sure if I'll be done or back by then. But anyways, May 13th.
I won't be in town either, so I won't be able to cover for you. Commissioner Connolly? Okay, Commissioner Connolly will take care of that for Commissioner Covarrubias. Thank you. On May 13th. Any other changes? Seeing none. Do we have Planning Commission comments? Any follow-up comments, Commissioner Marlowe?
Just real quick, I know it's late, but I was reading through these, and some of these emails we got are pretty intense. Did the city respond to these individually? I mean, obviously we can't, it's 100% moratorium on new housing. That's not going to happen, right? But do they understand that, like, we have to approve things within the bounds of the law, and as long as people are doing what they're supposed to, like, do they get responded to? I was just curious.
I think that one was mainly intended for the city council, so it's been forwarded to the council. Typically, a council member will either respond or direct it back to staff on that. So,
okay.
And then on the other one, we've been in contact with the other commenter fairly extensively on his concerns. Great.
Commissioner Connolly, any final comments?
No, thank you. I thought it was a good session, and we had a long session, but I thought it was very productive. So thank you to everyone.
Commissioner Davis.
I have a question and then a comment. Warren, have they done the open house for Fire Station 2 yet? Is it Fire Station 2?
3.
3, okay. When is that, or did they already have that?
I'll check on that and find out.
I did see something, and I wanted to go and
Okay.
and attend that. So I just wanted to get that on our calendars. Yeah, Katie, I know Genevieve's gone, all of staff. I think Darcy started. I know Darren, you're involved. This was a major undertaking. And so compliments to you on your patience with us. I mean, you've probably talked about it for many, many hours, and then we got our packet on Friday and tried to process it all. So thanks for bearing with our questions, and I do want to compliment staff. Thank you.
Great. Commissioner Covarrubias?
Nope, again, kudos to the staff, and I'll share one quick story. When my family moved here, was looking to move here in Paso Robles in the late 70s, I kid you not, out in the middle of nowhere, for the very first time as a teenager, looked up in the sky and went, holy shit, what are those? Coming from Los Angeles, I had never seen stars like that ever in my life. Instantly was amazing. So thanks for the work that you guys are doing. Appreciate that.
Commissioner Cochler?
Thanks to staff and consulting staff for all of this effort. I think the challenge, though, still lies ahead as to how you take all the work that's come together over now what's measured in years and make that understandable to the public in terms of a full document and how comment can be solicited in that. So it's a challenge, and you could, I'm sure, at least hit the high spots, but we'll be watching because it'll make our jobs easier too. But again, very well done.
Commissioner Neal?
I echo the great work done, and Sherry, it's April 13th, Saturday, from 10 to 2.
April 13th, 10 to, thank you.
Great. And this is Chairperson Christensen. I just wanted to say thank you to staff. I know, like was iterated already. I really appreciate the public comment as well. You know, some meetings we get none of that. It's always nice to have some clarification on some areas, on things that, you know, maybe we don't necessarily know anything about or cover on a regular basis. So truly, I appreciate that a lot. And again, staff, the great presentation. I know that's a lot of stuff for an undertaking. I kind of had one question. I know it's really late, but is this going to be, is the plan to make this interactive, all the charts? I mean, with AI today, I mean, making all the schedules and charts and language interactive, to me, seems like it would be something that would be possible and truly amazing for people to be able to get through it online fairly easy.
Yeah, our entire municipal code is currently online.
Yes.
I would not claim that it's easy to interact with. That's one of the problems. I think Genevieve also has some ideas, and I think it's within the scope of her work that she is going to be creating, I think, a Word document that's easy to use with, you know, links and so forth. But the entire municipal code is online and will be in better shape, hopefully, in the not too distant future.
Right. No, thank you. And I know it's online. I just, you know, making it with today's technology interactive is great. So with that, I don't have any other further comments. So do we have a motion to adjourn? Oh, I'm sorry. We're going to skip right past you since we did all the zoning code already.
Yeah.
Staff comments, sorry.
Just a couple quick things. One, and this one's kind of important, your Form 700, your annual disclosures due. I think there's 2 commissioners that we're still chasing around. So if you've heard from Melissa recently about getting that in by Friday, please get it in by Friday. On the Olson specific plan, so that planning area 13, the courtyard product, they're starting construction out there. They're in the process of pulling the 214 permits. So as you go out there, there's going to be a lot more activity very soon. The landing project, as I mentioned, that's the boys' school project, reuse project. That's been resubmitted. We're working on an initial review of their changes. We expect it'll probably come back through DRC April or May. So you know, you'll start to hear and see that project again fairly soon. And then Cal Poly, one of the senior, or actually the graduate level classes, is going to be doing kind of a design studio. So they're going to be looking at the area kind of about around the Union Road interchange, North Chandler Ranch, Barney Schwartz area. That's kind of it's actually one of those residential suburban areas that's basically programmed for a future specific plan. So they're going to do kind of a design, you know, study out there, and they'll be presenting their findings to the Planning Commission by the end of the year, you know, June basically. So stay tuned on that. That should be exciting, and that concludes staff's report.
Great. Thank you, Warren. Now do I have a motion to adjourn? All right, we're adjourned. Thank you, guys and ladies. Holy shit.
Glad I gotta get out at 45 in the morning.
Yeah.
Drive to Santa Barbara. Yeah. My wife. Yeah. Well, mine are solar powered.
I have solar powered, low voltage. Yeah. Actually, they're amazing what they do. I know.
Refined focus on it.
You have one spotlight though. It's a security spotlight. But it's
Sorry.
Thanks, guys.
Hey, thank you.
Long haul.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, you were there with us.
It was good for the newbies over here. I said, this is how I figured out.